Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Cabbage Head Fanfics. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku's Quirk Erased Itself? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Izuku leaned back in his chair. He stretched his arms above his head and looked down at the notebook in front of him. He'd started his notes on the villain attack this morning during roll call and had just finished them now as the teacher was making announcements. There were plenty of advantages to everyone thinking he was quirkless, and one of them was that teachers had a tendency to ignore him. Speaking of that, the teacher was talking about something high schools? Maybe? Something like that? Izuku wasn't too concerned. It was the beginning of his last year of middle school, and he already knew with absolute certainty where he would go for high school. He caught the word hero from the teacher, and the classroom erupted around him with cheers and students ignoring the rule of no quirk usage in class. Izuku wondered if he would ever get in trouble for using his quirk in school. Was it even possible? It was actually a sort of a mutation quirk since it also gave him the extra toe joint. So they couldn't fault him for always using it. Well, there was the mind control part, but that was also something he couldn't stop, no matter how much he wanted to. Izuku heard Bakugo whining loudly about something. Izuku wasn't that concerned. Bakugo made dramatic speeches all the time. At this point, Izuku could just replace anything he said with, "I am the best, and no one else is as good as me," and he didn't need to worry about missing anything. Izuku went back to looking over his notebook, checking for errors before closing the book up again, just in time to look up and see the entire class staring at him, then bursting into laughter. "Oh yeah, there was probably a reason you should pay attention in class." Midoriya? No way. You can't get into the hero course just by studying. Oh, so the teacher had probably told them that he was planning on going to UA. If Izuku had really been quirkless, he probably would have defended himself. Maybe would have been nervous and tried to explain how the UA rules actually did allow quirkless students. But he'd known that he had a quirk for his entire life. That was something he knew for certain. But he'd also learned it would be impossible to convince someone else of that fact. So Izuku had stopped bothering. He no longer cared about explaining himself. The only thing that mattered was what Izuku did. Justifying his decisions to other people wasn't worth his breath. His quirk might have had no use whatsoever, but it had given him armor against the taunts of his classmates. So, instead of panicking, Izuku blinked lazily at the class. "Oh, okay," he said, then looked back down at his notebook. He would be a hero regardless of whether his classmates thought it was possible. There was no point to defending himself. Izuku saw a familiar hand about to hit his desk. He grabbed his notebook and lifted it over his head. Bakugo's snarling face was inches away from Izuku's nose. He waited for Bakugo to start shouting before dropping his notebook onto the ground behind him. The noise rendered inaudible by Bakugo's shouting. Better let the pages get crumpled from the landing than charred by Bakugo's explosions. "Teach, Bakugo is breaking the no quirks in the classroom rule." Izuku leaned back and tilted his head to the side to make eye contact with the teacher. Izuku was an unrepentant snitch regarding shit that Bakugo tried to pull on him since he was quirkless. The teachers never did anything, but he could at least try. Said boy seemed even angrier than before, somehow. And he launched himself at Izuku using his explosions. Rather than try to meet him head-on, Izuku grabbed Bakugo's arm and sent him tumbling past Izuku's desk towards the back of the classroom. His own explosion sent him over the desk and the one behind it, and then almost into the back wall of the classroom. Bakugo barely stopped himself from colliding headfirst with the blackboard. There was a fair amount of snickering at Bakugo's somehow even more angry expression. He might be the most popular in the class, but he was still in butt. Izuku watched him for a moment before flicking his eyes back to the teacher, trying to convey, "Okay, I did my part, now you deal with him," with just his facial expression. Figuring Bakugo wouldn't try anything else, Izuku reached behind him to pick up his dropped notebook. He opened to the first page and the 2 columns of tally marks under the title. He added a mark to his column as the teacher made Bakugo sit back down in his desk. 72 Bakugo, 93 Izuku. Sweet, his lead was increasing again. Bakugo probably still thought that he won more, since he only counted fights with no teachers around and ones where Izuku didn't use his useless cowardly Deku tricks. But Izuku counted them. He knew that in real hero fights there would be no rules to follow and that any trick Izuku pulled would be just as effective for catching villains as Bakugo's raw strength. The side of Izuku's mouth twitched upwards. He hadn't even needed to stand up this time. At the end of the school day, Izuku slipped out of the classroom. Days when he put a tally mark on his side were days when Bakugo would try to get Izuku after class. It had been, 10 years since Bakugo had first come into his quirk. At this point, Izuku was probably more in tune with the other boys' habits than his own. Izuku moved through the corridors of the school. Taking a circuitous route to an exit, he knew Bakugo wouldn't send a lackey to play lookout for Izuku. After he opened the door, he paused to look both ways. No one. He closed the door behind him before sprinting toward the wall surrounding the school. He reached it going full speed, a speed which he turned into upward momentum with a trick he'd learned from a parkour class. He balanced on the top of the wall for a moment before letting himself drop to the ground, bending his knees till they almost touched the ground on. He straightened, but started to tip backwards due to the weight of his backpack. He pinwheeled his arms to stay upright, then sent them straight out forward after overbalancing. Nailed it. When he stood back up, he was greeted with the sight of a person staring at him. Izuku froze. The person had purple hair and eyes, and was staring with a sort of tired surprise that reminded Izuku of himself after seeing Bakugo do something exceptionally stupid too early in the morning. Hi. The purple-haired person just kept staring at him. Don't tell anyone from this school I did that. They told me to stop finding alternate exits after the roof incident. A purple eyebrow was raised. Purple eyebrows? That meant the purple hair wasn't dyed, probably a part of a quirk. Izuku wanted to ask about what kind of quirk would give a person just purple hair and no other physical changes, but decided against it. There was awkward silence for a few moments. Bye. Izuku said before turning on his heel and walking in the direction opposite the purple-haired person. That was a good name. Alliteration was always nice in names. It was around 5 minutes later when Izuku realized he was walking in the opposite direction of his house. Well, he could just figure out a route from where he was. He wandered until he found buildings that looked familiar, then started in the direction he thought home to be. Thinking back to the purple-haired person, he couldn't help but wonder what that interaction would have been like if he'd really been quirkless. That was something he wondered often. What if he'd been born quirkless? It couldn't have been all that different. Izuku's quirk was about as close to quirkless as you could get without actually being it. So close, actually, that every single person Izuku knew was absolutely certain that he didn't have a quirk. His mom, his doctor, his classmates, and every other person he interacted with. And sure, if he were quirkless that wouldn't be a problem, they would be right, and he could deal with that. But he had a quirk. The most useless one he'd heard of. It convinced everyone he didn't have a quirk. Well, sure, there were the few places it came in handy, made him more confident. Having a secret that no one knew, even one he didn't want to keep, made him feel comfortable. Knowledge is power, and he had knowledge and therefore power that no one else would ever have. But what if he'd been born with a powerful quirk? Something like Bakugo's, one that would springboard him to the starting line of becoming a hero. That was useless to think about though. He'd been born the way he'd been born. And now he was going to work harder than anyone else to become the best hero he could. Useless quirk or not, he would do it. The thought brought a wild smile to his face. He skipped forward a few paces, jumping up and slapping a sign telling him to watch his head. He hit the ground lightly and continued through the arch of the dark underpass the sign had been warning him about. Izuku was most of the way through the underpass when he heard the noise of liquid moving behind him, and he half turned to see what it was. His breath froze in his throat when he saw it. The thick green sludge was coming out of a grate on the ground. It formed into a single huge mass with a pair of bulging eyes and a huge wide-open mouth. Izuku knew what this was. A villain attack. He bolted towards the end of the tunnel. His combat training could do nothing here. The villain wasn't something he could punch or get in a headlock. His only option was to run as fast as he could. But all his training did nothing. He bolted towards the exit, only to be engulfed in the sludge. It was talking, but all Izuku could focus on was the sludge as it forced its way into his mouth. Izuku tried to stop it from going down his throat, but his mouth was pulled open by the sludge surrounding his face. He tried to pull at the sludge with his hands, but it slipped through his fingers. The villain said something in response, but Izuku wouldn't have been able to understand if he'd been trying. The sludge was surrounding his entire face, but his eyes and forehead. He could feel it pushing into his mouth, nose, and ears. His eyes started to water. Izuku had wanted to be a hero for as long as he could remember. From the time he first saw that video of All Might, he'd known he wanted to save people. He wanted to be someone who everyone could look to and feel safe. But now, he was being attacked by a villain and there was nothing he could do. Every moment he'd put into training would be wasted. All the time he'd put into making himself better was a waste in the face of the ingrained lead that the villain had been born with. He kept clawing at the liquid engulfing his face, but he knew it was useless. The edges of his vision were dimming. So this was it. This was how he was going to die. Not in some great fated battle against villains, but in a dirty, empty underpass at the sludge-like hands of a villain sprouting some nonsense about taking over. No warning, no build-up. Just dying in some random villain attack. His work to become stronger was worth nothing now. As sludge worked its way deeper into his throat, Izuku wondered how long it would take Mom to hear about him dying. Izuku was 3. He had just eaten breakfast and was playing with his All Might figurines in the living room. What quirk would he get? When Mama had been talking about quirks at breakfast, she'd said that people don't have a choice in what quirk they got. He couldn't help but wonder though. He wanted a quirk like All Might's. That would be so cool. But his quirk was something else. The thought was suddenly there. And there were lots of other thoughts he could somehow sense around him. Not really around him though. They were around his head. Not the outside, but the inside. He reached out towards them, trying to understand what they were. He felt them reach back to him and they started to explain themselves. But it was too much. All of them started speaking to him at once. Izuku jerked back, both in his head and with his body. He held both sides of his head and fell back, hitting his head against the couch. The single thought had gotten into his head, but there were so many other ones pushing in on him. He pushed his hands harder against his ears. His eyes were watering. He shook his head against all the thoughts trying to push their way into his mind. It was like dozens of people talking to him at once, each of them getting louder and louder as they all tried to tell him something different. He couldn't understand any of them, they were too loud. He couldn't tell, he couldn't even guess what each were saying. He pushed his hands into his head, they had to stop. It was too loud and he felt his own thoughts being pushed aside. It was quiet. The thoughts were gone. Izuku cracked open an eye. The living room was exactly the same as it had been before. He peeked through the kitchen doorway. There was Mama, still washing the dishes from breakfast. Izuku leaned back against the couch, wrapping his arms around himself. He focused on breathing and on the feeling of his mind only having his own thoughts in it. He was too scared to try and search for the thoughts again. Maybe just thinking about it would bring them back and they hurt. Instead, Izuku considered what he'd learned. He didn't have All Might's quirk, which was disappointing. But he now knew he had a quirk. He didn't know what it was yet, but he had one. It must be a good one too, since there was so many thoughts about it. But why did he know? Maybe that was just how people found out they had quirks. They just had a thing in their minds that told them everything they needed to know. That seemed a lot more organized than everyone just figuring out their quirks on their own. Mama must have just forgotten to tell him. He nodded to himself. That must be it. He needed to go tell Mama though. This was exciting. She would be so proud of him getting a quirk, even if he didn't know what it was yet. He made his way to his feet, wiping what was left of his tears onto his sleeve and running to his mom. Once he was at her side, he grabbed onto her skirt. Mama, I have a quirk. Izuku smiled at his mother as he told her. She was going to be just as excited as he was. Mom looked down at him. She was still at the sink, washing the plates from breakfast. Izuku couldn't see her face. The light streaming in through the window only let him see from her neck down. She started to say something, but Izuku was too excited to wait. The thoughts told me I have a quirk. I don't know what it is yet, but I know that I have one now. Izuku grinned up at Mama. He wished he could see her face to see how happy she was. She'd said she was excited to see when Izuku's quirk came. Izuku moved from grabbing onto Mama's skirt to hugging her knees. Izuku. Her voice didn't sound very happy, and he looked up in alarm. Had he done something wrong? What, Mama? She pushed him away from her knees, then crouched down to eye level. Oh no, she only crouched when he'd done something wrong. When she was happy, she would always pick him up. Izuku leaned back and saw Mama's face. She was crying. Izuku, please don't lie to me. What had he lied about? Especially about something like this. When your quirk comes, tell me right as it happens. But don't make up stories. Izuku could only stare wordlessly at her. What had he done wrong? Izuku sat on a stool in the office. Next to him was Mama. Across from them was the doctor. You should probably give it up. Izuku didn't look up from the All Might action figure in his hands. He had thought the doctor would open with something like that. He probably wanted to make sure the quirkless kid didn't get his hopes too high. So there's something wrong with him? Most of the other kindergartners' quirks have already manifested. He's the only one. Quirks rarely manifest after the age of 4, right? Izuku didn't look up at Mama as she talked. The doctor started to talk again, asking Mama about her and his father's quirks. Izuku decided he didn't want to listen anymore. He understood why the doctor thought he was quirkless. He knew because he'd been able to listen to more of the thoughts, or images, as he'd taken to calling them. He liked that name better. He could only understand one image each time he tried to ask his head about his quirk, then the rest would come all at once and he'd have to curl into a ball till they went away. The most helpful thing he had learned was that his quirk had 2 parts. First was what the images called the mutation part. It made it so even though he had a quirk, he had the extra toe joint. The doctor would probably talk about that. The second was the emitter part, the mind control part. It made it so people would always come to the conclusion he was quirkless. In most cases, that was the conclusion people would come to anyway. But the mind control part of his quirk made it so people came to the conclusion as soon as they heard him talk. Even just people Izuku passed on the street. Izuku remembered a few months ago when he and Mama had been walking home from his preschool. They'd started a conversation with someone else walking the same way. Then the conversation had moved to quirks. The person had ruffled Izuku's hair and told him that being quirkless was hard, but he would work through it. Apparently, all it had taken to convince them that he was quirkless was that Izuku speaking. Mama hadn't denied that he'd been quirkless. Maybe Izuku was really the one in denial. He could really be quirkless and he was just crazy and making up the images in his head. The person on the street, that could be explained as them having a quirk that let them sense quirks. He could just be making it all up. But he couldn't believe that. If he believed he was wrong about this, then he might be wrong about everything. Without this one thing he was sure of, he could never be certain anything he believed was right. Because the knowledge of what his quirk was something he was more sure of than anything. The only thing he could do to keep his sanity was to trust his gut. Besides, it had never been wrong before. Izuku looked up from his All Might action figure. The doctor was explaining how having an extra toe joint meant someone was quirkless. Izuku had called that earlier. That night he'd sat at the computer with the video of All Might playing in front of him. On the desk was a notebook. It wasn't his normal one for taking notes of heroes. Today he was going to take notes on how to make himself stronger. How could he become strong enough that even without a useful quirk he could save people? This video wouldn't help him. All Might relied on his quirk to give him an edge. It was a tool so powerful that he could save anyone that he wanted. Izuku needed something like that. Something that would make him strong and fast enough that he could save anyone. But just watching All Might save people wouldn't give him that. He closed the tab of the All Might video. He searched how early someone could safely start working out. Izuku. Oh, Mama hadn't left after she turned on the All Might video. Suddenly she pulled him away from the desk and was hugging him, wrapping arms around him and sobbing as she murmured meaningless comforts into his ear. He wished she would let go so he could continue researching. But she didn't. She probably thought he was heartbroken. That the doctor telling Izuku he was quirkless was a surprise and that Izuku would be broken by it. But Izuku knew this day had been coming. He knew eventually someone would tell Mama for certain that he didn't have a quirk and she would lose the hope that she'd been holding on to. Izuku wished he could offer her comfort. But if he tried to tell her he really wasn't quirkless, she would just think he was in denial. And if he tried to tell her he was fine with being quirkless, she would think he was lying. As always, Izuku couldn't help her. So he didn't try. Instead, he let her cry. Izuku had won the fight. He was bruised, burned, and tired. But he had won. At 8 years old, after who knows how many fights, he had finally beat Kaken. The kid that Kaken had been bullying was fine. Still sitting behind him. Unharmed. Izuku turned his back to where Kaken had limped away and gave the kid a bloodied smile. He said thank you and hugged Izuku. He asked him something that Izuku couldn't parse. Probably asking if Izuku needed help with his injuries. Though Izuku couldn't be sure. He just shook his head. After standing there for a bit, the kid left in the opposite direction of where Kaken had limped off to. Once he was out of sight, Izuku let himself slump down to his knees. Kaken had been wrong with his taunts over the years. Izuku had always known that he'd been wrong about Izuku being quirkless. But now Izuku knew that Kaken was wrong about Izuku being useless. He'd also been wrong by thinking Izuku would give up his dreams without a fight. Kaken. No, he wouldn't call him that anymore. Kaken was a cute nickname that one child would give to their friend. And he'd stopped being Izuku's friend long ago. Izuku pulled himself up, wincing at how sore he was from the fight. He'd won, but it definitely hadn't been easy. He should probably enter a martial arts class or something. He would need the edge against Bakugo in the fights to come. Izuku felt the sludge around him being blown away. He could breathe again. He was tired though, he could barely open his eyes. But he could see something familiar. A brightly colored costume and a familiar smile. All Might? The world went dark again. Izuku was jerked awake by someone hitting his cheek. They weren't hitting especially hard, but it was still too much to count as a pat. How had Izuku gotten there? The answer was on the tip of his tongue, but his head felt hazy and he couldn't quite find it. What could he find out about what was going on? He couldn't open his eyes. That would tell the person hitting him that he was awake and Izuku didn't want to lose whatever advantage he had. He'd just have to get information without sight. What did he know about the situation? Well, his eyes were closed. He was laying on what felt like cement. His clothes felt vaguely damp and his throat hurt, but there was nothing notable other than that. So if he ignored the person hitting him, he seemed safe enough. So he just had to stop the person hitting him. What did he know about them? They were hitting his left cheek repeatedly and saying some word over and over again. The voice sounded familiar for some reason, but the word wasn't. Some other language. English? Yeah, that seemed right. But that was enough just taking it. He had the choice between fight or flight. He'd probably go with fight since this person was just hitting him for no reason. He should start with some sort of grab. Headlock would work best since he didn't know how the person was positioned. Izuku carefully didn't let his breathing or expression change as he braced himself. Then launched upwards with both his arms and legs, to where he could hear the person's voice coming from. He wrapped his arms around a neck. A much thicker neck than he expected. Big enough that Izuku couldn't wrap his arms around them and get them into a headlock. Well, there goes that plan. The person stood up, and Izuku's feet left the ground, leaving him hanging with his arms wrapped around his attacker's neck. Judging by the fact that Izuku's feet barely reached his attacker's knees, they were much taller than he had expected. That coupled with the fact that all Izuku could feel was pure muscle meant he couldn't fight this person and hope to win. Damn it. Izuku had been hoping that someone repeatedly hitting him would give him a chance to practice sparring. He opened his eyes. From a few inches away, the blue eyes of All Might looked back at him. Oh, so that's why the voice had sounded familiar. Izuku had never seen All Might's face this close before. His scaras were pitch black. That was weird. Izuku thought that would be something people would know and talk about. All Might looked sort of lost. He was just standing dumbly with his arms awkwardly held up but not touching Izuku. Entirely at odds with the confident hero Izuku was used to seeing on his screen. Izuku decided that he should probably let go of the hero now and unhooked his arms from All Might's neck, letting himself drop to the ground. All Might hesitantly started to talk before he regained his usual rigor and began to explain something about the villain. That was how Izuku had gotten there. The villain had attacked him and Izuku hadn't been able to defend himself. All Might must have fought the villain and saved Izuku. The villain would have killed Izuku if All Might hadn't shown up. His training hadn't done anything. A low-level villain could have taken him out before he'd even had a chance to start being a hero. His training hadn't been nearly enough. He was going to need some other tool if he wanted to be able to save people. He sifted through his backpack till he found his phone. Then opened his browser and got ready to search for alternate tools. He would need to act quickly if he wanted to master whatever he could get his hands on before the UA entrance exam in 10 months. A slightly put-off cough distracted him. Oh yeah, All Might was still talking. The hero stood a few feet in front of him, posing and holding up a pair of 2-liter soda bottles. Wait, was that the sludge villain in the bottles? How did it even fit in there? Where had the rest of it gone? Had the bulk of the villain been made of something extraneous? Or had separating the villain's face from the rest of him meant the rest of the sludge was inert? Wait, oops, All Might had just saved Izuku. That was a pretty cool thing for the hero to do, regardless of if it meant that Izuku needed to get stronger. Izuku bowed politely and let out a string of mumbled thanks, then straightened after what he figured was enough time. All Might gave up on the pose with a sigh, then gave Izuku a double thumbs up around the pair of bottles. The man turned away and stuffed the bottles into the pockets of his cargo pants. Then turned his head back towards Izuku and awkwardly waved at him, saying something that Izuku figured was a goodbye. He dropped into a crouch and Izuku brought his phone back to his face, tapping the search bar. All Might was a pro hero. He would know about ways that the heroes made themselves stronger. What would be a better way for Izuku to learn about how to be stronger than from the strongest man alive? Izuku shoved his phone into his pocket and rushed towards All Might. He was crouched in the pose Izuku recognized as the one he went into when he was about to take off in one of his flight-like jumps. All Might couldn't leave yet. Izuku needed to talk to him first. He reached out to grab All Might's shoulder and was suddenly launched into the air. Izuku probably could have thought this out better. Grabbing onto a hero that was about to jump hundreds of feet into the air was a less than stellar idea. His grip on All Might's shoulder slipped, and for a moment Izuku thought he was going to fall back to earth before he managed to get a grip on All Might's leg. He'd seen videos of All Might's jumps before, and in an intellectual sense, he knew that they could take the hero hundreds of feet into the air. But actually seeing firsthand how high the hero could jump was utterly different. They were going fast enough that Izuku's hair was whipping around his face and he had to squint to avoid the air pulling at his eyelids. And the ground was so far beneath them that the people milling below looked like ants. After a moment All Might looked down and saw him. He said something then started flailing his leg, apparently to try and get Izuku to let go of him. Izuku squinted at All Might through a single eye, then glanced between the hero's face and the ground a few times. He didn't want to try talking with the wind still blowing in his face like it was. All Might seemed to pick up on the fact that Izuku falling right now would end in his death, and stopped flailing his leg. Instead, he pushed Izuku's face into his cargo pants and grabbed onto the back of Izuku's uniform collar. Izuku couldn't see whether they were close to landing or not. So he just held on as tight as he could and waited to see what was going to happen. Eventually they landed. All Might kept his footing and ended his jump with a few steps forward to maintain his balance, while Izuku ended up in a less than graceful tangle of limbs on the ground. He opened his eyes and took stock of where they had landed. It was a part of Muzutafu Izuku walked through often. He thought he recognized the building they were on. All Might said something Izuku missed, and he was reminded of what he had come here to ask the hero. He needed to do it soon though. The hero was already walking towards the edge of the building. Izuku could ask All Might if it was possible to become a hero at all without the use of a quirk. But he already had decided he was going to be a hero. He didn't need to be reassured of that. He didn't need All Might to tell him that he could be a hero. How can I become a hero without using a quirk? All Might paused and turned back from the edge of the building, and fixed his gaze on Izuku. Without a quirk? Then things took a turn that Izuku wasn't expecting. All Might transformed. It wasn't really a transformation, it was more like he deflated. One second he looked like he could bench press a medium-sized truck, the next he looked like a light breeze would be enough to topple him. He also let out a rough-sounding cough that was accompanied by a worrying amount of blood. All Might let out a string of curses. Oh, so it wasn't intentional. He hadn't been answering Izuku's question. He just accidentally turned into a very sickly-looking man, for whatever reason. All Might sat down, then started to talk. He was as thin as a rail, and the white shirt and cargo pants that had earlier fit him well were now loose and blew around in the breeze. He also had the same haircut as before. But instead of being pulled up in the signature All Might style, his bangs were drooping down in front of his face. All Might pulled the hem of his t-shirt up. The entire left side of his body was covered with a single gnarled injury. It was the color of a fresh bruise, and the skin around it was puckered and uneven. Now, this was interesting. Izuku had never heard of this injury or the smaller form, so they were probably connected somehow. Maybe he should actually start to listen to what All Might had to say. Pros are constantly risking their lives. I cannot simply say, you can become a hero without power. What? Izuku had asked how he could become a hero, not whether he could be one. All Might didn't think that Izuku would be able to become a hero. This was a waste of time. The only thing talking to All Might had given Izuku was another person to add to the list of people that he would prove wrong by becoming a hero. All Might was talking again, but Izuku started towards the stairs. He had a home to get back to, an afternoon run to do, and homework to get done. Izuku yanked the door open and started down the stairs, letting the door swing closed behind him. He took out his phone and opened the search engine. Back to plan A. If the #1 hero wouldn't give him tips on how to become a hero, he would just get them from the internet. As he typed, an explosion rang out in the distance. Oh, villain attack, and a flashy one from the sound of it. That could be interesting. Once again he pocketed his phone. His search could wait until tonight, but the villain attack could be over in minutes. He turned his walk down the stairs into a run, taking each flight in a few steps. Once he was at the ground level, he started towards the sounds of explosions, pulling his backpack into his shoulders to keep it from bouncing as he sprinted down the busy sidewalks. Once he was at the scene, he found himself especially glad he had hurried. Even considering how big most public villain attacks were, this one was noteworthy. It took up an entire street. The villain that Izuku couldn't get a good view of through the crowd was in the center, and around them fires were littering the pavement. The orange light from the flames made the scene look almost hellish. The pros were trying attacks, but none of them seemed to be successful. Izuku needed a better look at the villain before he could figure out why. He ducked his way through the crowd. He wasn't precisely slim anymore considering all the training he'd done in the past years, but Izuku was small enough that he could weave through the people at a reasonable pace. He ducked under someone's arm and found himself at the front of the crowd. He saw the villain clearly for the first time. Or rather, for the second time. It was the one from before. The sludge villain from under the bridge. Izuku thought All Might had captured it? Hadn't he seen the hero stuffing the bottles into the pockets of his cargo pants? But the bottles hadn't been there while they were talking on the roof. They must have fallen during All Might's jump. He looked closer at the villain. It was now yelling something. But it wasn't yelling at the heroes, or even at the crowds. The sludge was yelling at its hostage. In the sludge was a solid person. The fires must be because of the person's quirk. They were trying and failing to get out of the grasp of the sludge. The person had blonde hair and a middle school uniform and was struggling and letting off explosions. Then the person looked familiar, and after a moment Izuku realized why. He looked up at the crowd. And Izuku recognized the eyes of Bakugo Katsuki. But rather than looking proud or angry, his eyes held an expression Izuku had never seen on Bakugo before. He looked terrified. Before Izuku knew what he was doing, he'd passed the police line and was running towards the villain. He dodged the fires littering the concrete. What was he doing? Dealing with villains was the pro hero's job. Not a job for some random civilian. But he couldn't stop now. The analyses from his notebook flashed through his mind, and as he got within yards of the sludge villain, he pulled off his backpack and launched it at the villain's eyes. It reared back, and he reached Bakugo as it was distracted. He started to dig at the sludge and managed to grab Bakugo's arm. He pulled, and the sludge let out a squelching noise as Bakugo started to come free. Izuku managed to pull him out to his shoulder before he noticed that Bakugo was shouting something at Izuku. A question? It could wait. Just as Izuku was pulling Bakugo's second shoulder from the sludge, the villain stopped pawing at its eyes with its sludge appendages and started to lean back to them, letting out a string of what Izuku figured were threats, considering the situation. Bakugo wasn't entirely out of the sludge yet. He wouldn't be able to get free in time. Izuku wouldn't be able to save him. This was the second time that he wasn't strong enough to save someone today. Damn it. Then someone else was there. He grabbed Bakugo and pulled him from the sludge. Then held him, along with Izuku, under one arm while the other hand was drawn back to wind up for a punch. Detroit Smash. All Might. As the world went dark, Izuku wondered how many other people had been saved by All Might twice in one day. Izuku looked up at the orange sky as he walked down the empty side road. He had his phone in his hand, but he didn't feel like turning it on yet. He could have died today twice. If All Might hadn't been in town, or if he'd been too slow, or if he's been stopped by that injury thing on his side, Izuku would be in a morgue right now. That was an unsettling thought to have. If he were a hero, he'd probably have that thought often. Despite the glamour of it, heroics was a dangerous job. A single mistake could leave a hero seriously injured or dead. But he wanted to be a hero. He wanted to be someone that people could look to and feel safe. He wanted to save people. He could do that if he became a hero. If he got into UA, then he could get his hero license as soon as his second year of high school. It wouldn't be easy, he knew that. But he also knew that he could do it. He'd work hard, he'd be smart, and he'd use every tool at his disposal. Izuku would be a hero. The unmistakable sound of Bakugo shouting at him came from behind Izuku. He let out a soundless sigh as he turned to face Bakugo. He was 20 feet from Izuku, and as soon as they were face to face, Bakugo went into full-on yelling mode. Though admittedly Bakugo looked more upset than angry. It was probably something about Bakugo not owing Izuku for today. That sounded in character for him. After around a minute, Bakugo turned and ran off. Izuku blinked. That was all? No explosions, no grabbing Izuku by the collar? Bakugo must really be growing up. Izuku snorted under his breath, then turned back towards his house and started to walk. Hopefully, he could get home with no more diversions. All freaking might appeared from around a corner. He was in classic muscle form, and he puffed out his chest and started to talk. He even pulled a couple poses. At least until his body once again let out a puff of smoke and he shrunk to the smaller form again. After a few seconds of coughing blood, he started to talk again. The blood thing had happened earlier too, right? Wasn't that a really bad thing concerning someone's health? Coughing blood meant that he had blood in his lungs. Izuku should have paid attention when All Might had been explaining his injuries earlier. Speaking of that, Izuku focused back on All Might and realized the hero was thanking Izuku for something. For what? Before he voiced his question, the hero's speech moved on to another topic. Oh, so now he thought that Izuku could be a hero. After All Might had told him earlier that his dreams were impossible, now he believed that Izuku would be a great hero. Well, he seemed to have proved All Might wrong much faster than he anticipated. You are worthy to inherit my power. Izuku's head snapped toward All Might's face. What? Was he serious? Izuku had never heard of that being a thing. Was something like that even possible? You actually reacted to something I said. All Might lifted his arms like making Izuku react to him was a victory, then continued. I was worried that you were just tuning me out. Anyway, it's just a suggestion. The real show starts after this. Listen, young man, you need to decide whether or not you're going to accept my power. That was a massive shift, from telling Izuku that he should give up on his dreams to asking if Izuku would accept All Might's power. But regardless of that, this was what Izuku needed. If he had All Might's power, then he would be so much stronger. This could be just the tool that he needed if he wanted to pass the physical portion of the UA entrance exam in 10 months. Izuku focused back on All Might. Well, it's up to you. What'll you do? All Might had his hand on one side of his face, but his one visible eye was staring intensely at Izuku. There really was no need for deliberation on Izuku's part. I'll do it. Izuku continued to walk forward as he bent down at his waist and smoothly glided his hands down his left calf. Then straightened up to repeat the process with his right leg. After a few more repetitions, he switched from doing the calf stretches to a high knee jog. Usually, before he ran, he would do warm-ups, though almost never for this long. He'd been doing all the stretches he could think of for the past 10 minutes or so. The meeting place that All Might had told him to go to was further away than the park that he would typically jog through, so he had decided to take advantage of it by taking the chance to warm up. Izuku switched to lunges, slowing down a bit to keep his balance. He was out of the residential area his neighborhood resided in, and now the only buildings visible were industrial. The sun was rising, and it painted the buildings, along with Izuku's misting breath, a pale red. The idea of All Might texting him instructions had only struck him as odd yesterday night. He'd lost his unreasonable fanboy feelings toward All Might years ago, but he was still the #1 hero. One of the strongest people alive. But 2 days ago he'd offered Izuku his power. Now he was telling Izuku where to go so they could start Izuku's training. Not that Izuku hadn't trained in the past, but now he was doing it so that he could inherit All Might's quirk. He stopped lunging and transitioned to a jog. The buildings were thinning out, and the beach that All Might had told him about was coming into view. Izuku was going to be able to save people, he wouldn't be helpless the next time he was attacked by a villain, and he would be able to help the next time someone needed to be saved. Finally, he would be on even ground with everyone around him. Quirks gave people an ingrained head start, and now he would be at the starting line with them. He could get ahead through his own determination and skill rather than being behind no matter what he did. He tried not to dwell on it too much in the past, but the idea had always been lurking somewhere in the back of his mind. Not that he was really quirkless, but since his quirk was so attached to the idea of pretending not to be a quirk, then he could just pretend that he didn't have a quirk either. He finally arrived at the beach, not that it really could be called that, it was piled with trash as far as he could see. Definitely not a place to enjoy a family picnic. He slipped his phone from his sweatshirt pocket, 5:48 a.m. He had 12 minutes till the time that All Might had told him to be at the beach. Though All Might seemed like the type of person to arrive early, so maybe Izuku wouldn't have to wait quite that long. He jumped onto the railing that separated the sand of the beach from the street and started to pace back and forth. It was one of the first parkour tricks that he'd mastered, mostly for the entertainment value. He was right about All Might being punctual. After maybe 5 minutes of him pacing back and forth, All Might arrived, pulling up in a pickup truck that looked like it belonged in some American suburb rather than a densely populated area of Japan. He got out after a few seconds and made his way to Izuku. He was wrapped in an oversized coat and a scarf and was holding a folder of papers under his arm. He was in the sickly form again. Izuku wondered if the reason for why All Might had a second form was important. Hopefully, at some point, he could bring it up and figure it out. "Greetings, my boy." Izuku consciously made an effort not to tune out All Might. That could be considered rude, especially after the hero had offered to give his quirk to Izuku. "I hope you are feeling well. I don't know many teenagers that enjoy being up this early in the morning." "I wake up this early to do training fairly often," Izuku offered. It seemed relevant. "It's not that much of a change for me." "Oh yes, about your training." All Might hesitated for a moment, then asked, "You are sure that the plan you sent me is really what you're doing? It seems like an intense, it seems like something that someone as young as yourself would have difficulty following." All Might ended his statement by lifting the tone of his voice like he was asking a question. What did he want to know? Yeah, it's what I normally do. I don't know anyone else my age that does anything as intense, but I've been building up to it for a while." Izuku paused. Did All Might know something Izuku didn't? Was something wrong with his training plan? "I've never seen anything that would suggest that it was bad for me to do as much as I do." "Oh no. No, of course not. It's just that this was much more than I was expecting from someone as young as you. I assure you that it is in no way negative." All Might's expression broke from vaguely worried to excited, and he pulled up the folder of papers. "In fact, if you're really sticking to this plan, then you'll be able to inherit one for all much sooner than I first anticipated." "Oh, so that was the name of All Might's quirk. I had some reservations in choosing you, but it really seems like you're going to do great." All Might offered with a grin. It looks like you'll be able to take it within 5 or 6 months rather than 10. 5 or 6 months. Izuku wasn't really sure what expression he was wearing, but whatever it was made, All Might let out an undignified snort. "Oh yes, I forgot to tell you, didn't I?" All Might said, rubbing the back of his head. "This power is perilous for those who aren't prepared for it. If you don't have sufficient strength, then you will suffer serious damage when using it. And even after I give one for all to you, I would suggest that you continue training. Wasn't the fact that inheriting your quirk requires months of training something you should have told me when you were pitching your quirk to me?" "Oh yes. Well, the thing about that is, you see that dash?" All Might started to wave his hands around in mostly meaningless patterns and jerked his eyes away from Izuku to stare at the piles of trash littering the beach. "Oh yes. I need to tell you about an important part of your training. You'll be cleaning this beach." That was quite the subject change. Izuku eyed All Might for a second but decided to drop it. "Cleaning?" Izuku asked, somewhat dubious, eyeing what little he could see of the sand. "Yes. Along with everything else I've outlined here," All Might said as he shoved the papers he still was holding towards Izuku. "It'll be tough, but after looking at your normal workout routine, I have a guess that working hard is something you're used to." Izuku started looking through the papers. Wow, that was detailed. All Might had even written when he should wake up and sleep. It was definitely more than Izuku had ever planned for himself. Though Izuku had never had any specific deadline in mind other than the UA entrance exam. He supposed that he would have started ramping up his training to get ready even if All Might hadn't offered Izuku his power. But this was ridiculous. Well, almost ridiculous. It made sense that power like All Might's quirk required a lot from the person that inherited it. Though Izuku found it gratifying that his work will have a real effect. He'd shaved 4-ish months off of the time it would take him to be ready for All Might's quirk. If it had taken 10 months, then he'd barely have any time to get used to his new quirk before the entrance exams for UA. He sure as hell was glad that he'd avoided that. Izuku felt pressure on his stomach and sides, and the world around the papers in front of his face tilted. He craned his neck around and realized that All Might had regained his larger form and was carrying Izuku under his arm towards the garbage-covered beach. Ave to get him out of this ignoring people thing. "Gran would have had a fit if I'd ever ignored him like this," was what Izuku caught All Might's muttering. Well, he wasn't wrong. Izuku really needed to train himself out of ignoring people, especially if he wanted to become a professional hero. At the whiteboard, the teacher gave the lesson for the homework that Izuku was currently finishing. He was at the back of the classroom so could get away with it, though the fact that teachers generally avoided interacting with him probably helped. The fact that he was allowed to do this was the only reason he was sane right now. He had been doing large amounts of his homework during his classes for the past several weeks. If he'd had to do all his day-to-day homework after school, alongside with All Might's training, his own research on heroes, and studying for the UA finals, he'd probably go insane. His grades were slipping, but he was getting better at figuring exactly how much effort he had to put in to get an acceptable grade. He wasn't in the top 2 of the class regarding grades anymore, but he wasn't at the bottom of the class. He was more hovering in the above-average range. All Might had been upset when he learned that Izuku's grades were going down, but when Izuku argued that it allowed him to get more sleep, All Might had conceded the point. Which was actually a valid argument on Izuku's part. Before he'd changed to his less dedicated system of doing homework, he'd been barely getting enough sleep. Since he had a training session in the afternoon and had to get up at 4 in the morning for his morning sessions. He'd noticed that he'd grown since he started doing more homework at school. Actually having time to get enough sleep was great. There were all sorts of little things like scheduling that kept coming up, and it made Izuku think about how it was all becoming real. Izuku always knew he would become a hero, but now it was real and happening. He had a concrete plan for how he was going to get into UA. Though the training was less than pleasant. Creating a final design for his costume had been fun, even though it had actually been pretty hard. He'd realized his old designs from years ago featured little to no functionality. Eventually, he decided to go with something less eye-catching and more practical. The only things he'd included as personal touches were a homage to All Might's smile in his mouthguard and the jumpsuit being his mom's favorite color. This wasn't the time to think about UA stuff though. He had math homework to do. He leaned forward to finish a problem on his worksheet and his bangs fell in front of his eyes. He pushed them out of the way and let out a huff of frustration. That kept happening, he really needed a haircut. The sound of a bell rang through the classroom and Izuku looked back up. Oh, school was over. He glanced down at his math homework, mostly done, though the last few problems were blank. He could just do them in English tomorrow. He stood and started packing his stuff into his backpack, but a figure came into his field of vision and slammed a pair of smoking hands on his desk. Huh? Bakuga hadn't talked to him since the sludge thing a few weeks ago, had he? Oh well, it had been peaceful while it lasted. Izuku managed to pull his backpack on before Bakuga grabbed the collar of Izuku's jacket with one hand and pulled Izuku upwards. He was glaring like Izuku rarely saw out of him anymore. It took Izuku a moment to realize that Bakuga wasn't talking. He was just holding Izuku up by the collar of his jacket. Not that it was especially intimidating since Izuku was almost as tall and much bulkier than Bakuga was. Though it was unnerving that he was just glaring instead of saying anything. Usually, there would be barely a moment between Bakuga's outbursts. Now he was just quiet. Wait, no, he was talking now, never mind. Not shouting though, just a sort of furious whisper that Izuku found a relief compared to Bakuga's more traditional shouting. Izuku was on the fence on whether he should tune into Bakuga's speech. But maybe he should. He could use it as some sort of positive reinforcement with Bakuga to get him to shout less. Don't care what it is, but don't let whatever you're involved in get connected to me. You got it? Oh, so that's what it was. Bakuga didn't want whatever shady stuff Izuku was involved in to be tracked back to him. For someone as capable as he was, Bakuga was really worried about some small thing keeping him from getting into UA. Izuku let Bakuga finish his speech. He wasn't gonna bother telling Bakuga anything about his training. If he avoided Izuku because he was worried about being caught up in Izuku's shady stuff, Izuku wasn't gonna stop him. Izuku realized Bakuga had stopped talking. He should agree? Probably 50% chance of that being right anyhow. Izuku nodded as if he'd just heard and agreed to everything Bakuga had said. Which was apparently the wrong thing to do, judging from the way Bakuga tried to lift Izuku up by his uniform. Well, that was the wrong call. Should have answered in the negative. Planning on letting whatever this is fall down on me? Let me tell you if you dash. Well, time to bail. 1 second Izuku's hands were raising in a vaguely placating gesture. The next Izuku looped his arms together below Bakuga's arms and yanked them violently upwards. Bakuga had a split second where he tried to keep his grip on Izuku's shirt before he realized doing so would gain him a pair of busted elbows. Bakuga jumped back, hands starting to spark and teeth bared. So now Izuku had the choice between fight or flight. Usually, he would be all for a match, but he had training with All Might in half an hour. And he didn't want to be late or need to explain to All Might why he'd gotten into a fight with a classmate for a reason he didn't actually know. So Izuku took advantage of Bakuga backing off and made a break for the door. By the time he was through the doorframe, he was going at a full-on sprint. He ducked left, the opposite way as the front entrance of the building, and started weaving through the loose crowd of middle schoolers littering the hallway. After a few doorways, he found a stairwell and ran up 2 flights of stairs to the top floor. Once there, he slowed down and exited the stairwell. Now he just needed to get to the other side of the building and exit out the back door. It was his regular route for staying away from Bakuga when getting out of school. However, when he heard a certain blonde boy yelling commands to his cronies downstairs to block the staircases, he changed his plans. Time for Plan B. He hadn't had a chance to try it yet, he'd been waiting for a better reason. But this seemed like it was a good time to try it. Izuku reached his escape route. The primary challenge was that it was a window on the 3rd floor. Not that bit that was any sort of repellent to Izuku. He yanked open the window and stuck out his head, looking around. A few feet to his right was the rusty fire escape. He shrugged off his backpack and tossed it onto the platform. No going back now unless he wanted to go around the long way. He crouched in the windowsill and braced his arms on the sides of the window. He paused for a few moments, then launched himself at the fire escape. He clanked into the side and his bottom half was left awkwardly hanging over the side of the railing for a moment. But he managed to pull himself onto the platform in a less than graceful tangle of limbs. He laid there a few moments, then pulled himself upright. He pushed away the hair that had fallen into his eyes and grabbed his backpack. None of this was actually necessary or safe, but he figured that it was good practice for the things that he would need to do as a hero. Plus it was a lot of fun. Izuku made his way down the fire escape. Then he dropped the remaining 10-ish feet onto the dirt ground. He made his way to the wall surrounding the school. He took his time to scale it, no reason to rush today. Once he scaled it, he balanced on top, stuck his hands in his pockets, and took a leisurely look around. He saw the purple-haired person again. He was walking down the alleyway with his head down and his shoulders hunched. He didn't seem to see Izuku. Izuku could actually talk to him this time. The last conversation he'd had with the purple-haired person, or Purple as he's just decided to call him, he'd just gotten in trouble with the school for the roof incident, but that had mostly blown over by now. Izuku let himself drop down from the wall. In a much more controlled fall than last time, he barely needed lift his arms for balance. Purple jumped as Izuku landed in front of him. He jerked his hands up from his pockets and took a half step backward. "Hello." Purple kept his hands up and held his gaze evenly leveled on Izuku. Izuku nodded at him. "Why do you keep jumping down from the fence?" Purple asked. And wow, his voice sounded just as tired as he looked. "Because I'm training to be a hero and heroes do lots of weird jumping over things stuff, so I figure that a bit of practice jumping over things can't hurt," Izuku told Purple. "Oh." Purple rubbed his forehead. "Of course you're training to become a hero too. What else would a fence-hopping guy like you be planning on doing?" Oh, Purple was also training to become a hero. That was interesting. They could keep talking, but Izuku needed to get to his training session with All Might soon. They'd probably have other chances to speak later. "Bye," Izuku offered as he walked past Purple, this time making sure he went in the correct direction. Izuku rolled his shoulders and winced at the soreness in his back and upper arms. He definitely needed to ice tonight. Afternoon practice had been non-stop dragging large chunks of metal to All Might's truck for 3 hours, and he was definitely feeling it. Not that All Might's training was actually impossible. It was just terrible. Actually, how much worse would have it been if Izuku hadn't already been training before this? Before he started All Might's plan, he'd had his own regimen, but without it? That would actually have been a living hell. He winced at the thought. He interlaced his fingers, brought his arms up, and slowly leaned his arms as far back as they could go. The motion tipped his head up and brought his attention to the sky. The sun was still visible, though it was dipping down to the horizon. The sky itself was turning midnight blue but was lit up with streaks of pale orange-tinged clouds and the final golden rays of the setting sun. He stepped to the edge of the sidewalk and stared at the sky for a few moments. He'd had almost no free time in these last few months, and it felt great to just relax. After a few minutes of mindless stillness, he shook his head and continued onward. Mom had said that she would be home from work later than usual, so even with training after school, he had a while before he really needed to get home. He wasn't hungry, so getting food somewhere was out. So what could he do for the next hour or two? He didn't really want to go home. It was Friday, so it wasn't like he was in any hurry to get homework done. He bent his neck downwards and examined his shoes. As he did, his hair swung down and curled unhelpfully in front of his eyes. Oh, that was something that he could do. Yeah, a haircut would be perfect. "Izuku, what happened to your hair?" It wasn't quite a screech, but it was close to it. It was definitely much higher than Mom's normal voice. Izuku rubbed the back of his head. Rather than feeling his normal semi-rat's nest of curls, his hand ran across a short stubble of hair. It was oddly disconcerting. "I got a haircut." "I see that, honey, but why so short?" Mom asked. She'd taken off her oven mitts and was gesturing for Izuku to let her touch his head. He had to crouch with his knees touching the ground for her to do so. "I've always had longer hair. I wanted to see what it would look like short." He'd had a mini heart attack when he'd first seen his hair in the mirror. He didn't really dislike it, but he wasn't sure that he liked it yet either. Huh. Mom seemed kind of entranced. She was repeatedly rubbing her hand back and forth across the stubble on his head. "It's not even an inch long, but it's still curly. It's like you have a mossy helmet." Izuku couldn't figure out whether or not he liked that comparison. He wasn't often that concerned with what he looked like, but he felt off balance without his normal mess of hair. "Oh, Izuku, Mom stopped rubbing his head and took his face in her hands. He stood back up and looked down at her. He'd been growing a lot recently, and it seemed like every day his mom looked smaller. She rubbed a thumb over his cheekbone, eyes watering. "Look at you growing up so fast. You look so grown up and handsome. I can't believe you're still in middle school. You look like you're an adult." She was really crying now. "With your hair so short you look so handsome. My little boy is all grown up." Izuku moved forwards and carefully lifted Mom up, pulling her into a gentle hug. Her feet bumped against his knees. But she gripped him hard enough that Izuku suspected she was hugging him as hard as she could. He decided that he liked his new haircut. They stayed like that for a minute before Mom started to laugh and Izuku set her down. "See," she said, rubbing at her eyes. "You're getting so big and strong." She patted his shoulder. "I mean, look at you, soon you won't be able to fit through the door." A bit of an exaggeration, but it was true that Izuku had bulked up quite a bit. "I think it's 'cause of all that food you're feeding me." A few weeks ago Izuku had handed her the paper with the dietary restrictions and recommendations that All Might had given him. She'd just shaken her head and started cooking with these things in mind. This was probably mostly due to the number of different diets and exercise regimens Izuku had gone through over the years. At some point, Mom had just accepted it as something he did and started cooking around it. She really was great. "Course it is." Mom wiped her eyes and was pulling on her oven mitts. "Speaking of that, it's Friday, so you have no reason not to help me with dinner tonight." "Ah dang," Izuku said. "I guess I'll just have to help you." "Oh yeah," Mom said, remembering something and turning a little more serious. "Don't just do something like that without telling me. I suppose a haircut isn't a big deal, but still, you're developing a habit of doing things without telling me. Just give me a heads up next time you're planning something." "All right," Izuku agreed easily. He pointed at some vegetables set out on the cutting board. "These need to be cut up, right? How thick do you want them?" "Eat this." Izuku stumbled back from the long blonde hair that had just been offered to him out of the blue. He stepped back and tripped on the sand, but managed to regain his balance. That's hair." All Might laughed at him, just straight up laughed at him. Not even a quiet laugh, he was in his big form so it boomed and echoed all around the empty beach. Admittedly, it hadn't been Izuku's best witty comeback, but still, he felt like the situation justified it. Something about Izuku's displeasure must have made itself onto his face because All Might shook his head and quieted down. "Yes, this is hair," he said, completely deadpan. Izuku gave him a flat look. "Let me explain though, to inherit one for all, the successor has to eat the DNA of the person before them. It doesn't matter what exactly you eat, just that you have to eat some of their DNA. Thus, eat my hair." All Might stuck out his arm, offering it to Izuku again. This might have been revenge on All Might's part for some similar non-sequiturs and bomb drops on Izuku's part. Maybe. Probably. Oh well, looks like this was Izuku's life now. It turned out that there was no immediate effect after he ate All Might's hair. Other than Izuku feeling like he needed to retch. They ended up having a couple of hours to wait. They decided to kill time at one of the restaurants close to the beach. A 24-hour American-style breakfast place. It wasn't really in line with Izuku's diet, but All Might waved this away and told him to make an exception for today. It was the day he'd get his quirk. It was something to celebrate. Once they were there, Izuku absently ordered an egg and sausage dish and focused on trying to feel the difference that one for all made. So far he'd felt nothing. He didn't feel any different. There was no feeling of energy, all that he felt was vaguely hungry. He wasn't too worried. It would show up on its own time. All Might though, he was another story. They were sitting at a booth, waiting for food to arrive, with All Might across from Izuku. He was not so subtly freaking out. He was leaning forwards, fidgeting with his fingers and occasionally muttering under his breath. It was pretty obvious that he was worried about the transfer not working, which struck Izuku as odd. Why would All Might be worried about it not working? Hadn't he done this exact thing before, with him being the recipient? Izuku couldn't figure it out, but he wasn't concerned. Even if All Might's worries were justified and it didn't work, they could still just try again. All Might quieted down and sighed, stilling his fingers and wrapping them around his mostly empty coffee mug. So how are you feeling? Anything seems different? All Might asked, resting on his elbows on the table and leaning forward. Not really, but I'm not sure why it would. It's an emitter quirk, right? That means that the only time it does anything would be when I'm using it. Izuku said. It kind of felt weird to be the one reassuring the number one hero. All Might seemed mollified by this though. He nodded and leaned back, crossing his arms. Good point, young Midoriya. To be honest with you, I can't think of a reason this wouldn't work. It's just a feeling, I suppose. He shook his head, expression troubled. It's just something keeps nagging at me, but I can't think of what it might be. Izuku wasn't sure what to say, so he just shrugged. There was a brief pause, which was broken by the server coming with their orders, or rather, Izuku's order. Here you go, sweetheart, she said, laying down Izuku's plate. She turned towards All Might and set her platter on her hip. You sure you don't want something too, hon? No offense meant, but you look a missed meal away from being blown away in a stiff breeze. No thank you, All Might said, sounding embarrassed at the attention. I wouldn't mind more coffee though. All right, hon, she said, shaking her head and refilling All Might's coffee cup. Just send me a holler if you change your mind. She bustled away to another table. Izuku speared himself a piece of egg, but before he took a bite he asked, why not order a meal though? All Might paused, staring at his hands for a moment before coming to a decision. You remember when I was telling you about the injury I sustained? Izuku didn't remember that, but he nodded anyway. When I sustained it, I had to have multiple surgeries afterward. In one of them, they had to remove my stomach. This means that I'm unable to eat proper meals. I have to drink specially made liquid meals instead. Izuku winced at this. Not being able to eat sounded terrible. All Might looked slightly uncomfortable and took a gulp of his coffee. There was an odd emotion on his face, something between regret and pain, and Izuku didn't like seeing it on his childhood hero's face at all. Even if it was the skeleton version of his childhood hero. For once Izuku decided that he would be the one to breach the awkward silence. So, since you can't be All Might all the time anymore, what do you do with your spare time? All Might looked better now that he was thinking about something. Not all that much, I suppose. Most of my time is spent preparing to teach at UA. I've never been a teacher before, so there's a mountain of training and paperwork I need to sort through. He shook his head, smiling. I'm lucky I have a close friend on the police force that's been helping me with all of it. A friend on the police force? Izuku supposed that it made sense, as heroes worked closely with the police, but he'd never really thought about it before. Though I find I actually enjoy just talking to people as my civilian persona, All Might said, smiling into the middle distance. I never really had time for that in the past. It must be weird, not being recognized all the time. I mean, you're All Might. Izuku was actually getting better at this conversation thing. It made it easier that All Might was the one doing all the talking, but Izuku was improving at listening to what people said. Well, with some people, mostly just All Might. Izuku suspected the main reason he tuned people out was that they were never willing to believe he could be a hero. He had made progress though, he could listen to what All Might said consistently now. Well, actually, not as much as you'd think. I used to be a civilian. I wasn't always recognized the moment I set foot on the street. All Might chuckled. Yeah, that's true, Izuku said. I always think of you as All Might, the hero. But you must have been a real person at some point. All Might snorted, but the corner of his mouth twitched upwards. After that, they lapsed into silence, but this time it was comfortable rather than tense. Izuku finished his breakfast. Or his lunch. It was breakfast food, but it was past noon. He stared at his empty plate. No, it was lunch. The classification of the meal was decided by the time, not the content of the meal. Satisfied that he'd come to the right conclusion, he glanced around the restaurant. It had filled up since he and All Might had shown up. It was a Saturday, but Izuku wasn't sure if that meant this was more or less busy than a normal lunch rush. All Might noticed Izuku was finished. He stood up and walked towards the counter. By the time Izuku grabbed his gym bag and followed him, he'd already paid and was exiting the restaurant. Izuku considered paying All Might back but decided against it. He was the number one hero. Buying lunch for someone probably wouldn't even register for him. Izuku jogged a few steps to catch up with All Might. They walked abreast towards the beach. When they reached it, Izuku found a grin creeping across his face. It had taken him 5.5 months, but he had finished clearing the beach of the mountains of trash. And since it was a Saturday afternoon, people were trickling in to enjoy it. Sure, it wasn't busy, but there were people enjoying the beach. He'd caused that, he'd been the one that made these people able to have a good time. It was an amazing feeling. They didn't stop there though. They went past the section of populated beach towards the pile of trash that was unobtrusively stacked on the sand, away from the waves. It was all that was left of the huge mounds of trash. They decided to leave this area alone so Izuku could practice with one for all without damaging anything valuable. They reached the pile and stood side by side, examining it. It was around 15 feet tall at the pinnacle. The main body was closely packed together, but around it was a loose cloud of smaller bits of trash. So, any tips on how to use one for all? Izuku asked, eyeing it. All Might turned towards Izuku, hanging his hands at his sides and looking Izuku straight in the eye with complete seriousness. Make sure you clench your butt. Izuku had to fight hard to keep his expression serious, but he managed it. Also, I wouldn't suggest trying something impressive on your first attempt, All Might said, dropping his air of faux seriousness and resting his chin on his fist. Even with all your training, there's no way that you could deal with the full power of one for all. You'd end up with broken limbs at the least, not something we want without a hospital near. Izuku sent All Might a look to remind him how unenthused he was about All Might having only told him about this after Izuku had agreed to inherit one for. Oh yes, I know, All Might said, waving a hand. I should have mentioned that. My apologies. Izuku may or may not have brought up this topic very often over the past months. All Might had gotten better and better at reading Izuku since he started training. All Might was probably the only person who could make something of Izuku's myriad nonverbal communications. Other than Mom, of course. Izuku supposed it made sense that a professional hero would be good at reading people. Izuku still ribbed on All Might for not telling him about the arm-breaking thing. Not that Izuku was all that good at giving people all relevant information, but still. Izuku made a vague waving motion with his hand at All Might and ambled over to the pile of trash. He considered what he should try. His first instinct was to punch something, but All Might's warning made him hesitant to do so. So what should he do? Well, even if it was able to be passed on, it still was a strength quirk. He should do a normal strength quirk thing. He looked around for something to pick up. Oh, that would be perfect. He picked his way through the debris field surrounding the pile and towards the medium-sized minivan. He'd moved it here a week ago. It had taken him an hour to move it from the shoreline to this spot. It was probably the biggest thing in the pile. He crouched down at the side of the minivan and closed his eyes. What had All Might said? Clench your butt? Despite his ridiculous DLVY, he'd probably been serious about doing that. Izuku took a deep breath, clenched his butt, and thought about channeling his new quirk. He crouched there feeling ridiculous for maybe a minute before he felt something happen. He couldn't quite describe it. He couldn't see any outward change, but he felt different. It was like something flowed from his core into his entire body, filling every vein with subtle crackling energy that was completely unfamiliar to him. It was like someone had pumped adrenaline right into his veins. Everything around him snapped into focus and the world around him slowed to a crawl. He crouched there, just breathing. The sound of the surf crashing on the beach was crisp and somehow louder than just a moment before. The light from the sky was brighter and more focused. So this was one for all. Izuku focused on the minivan in front of him and reached out with his arms. He gripped the bottom edge of the car, then lifted it upwards. It moved unbelievably easily. Izuku didn't stop there though. He brought the minivan up to an angle and then carefully walked his hands down it until they were spaced a few feet apart and holding the minivan up by the center of the undercarriage. Izuku let the car dip down a little bit, putting more weight on himself. Then he slowly balanced the car, leaving his arms fully supporting it. He stood, bringing the minivan up with him. It swayed slightly as he moved, so he dug his fingers into the metal of the car to get a better grip. It was like sinking his hands into clay. He grinned. Izuku had gotten one for all and he was lifting a freaking car like it was a toaster. He swung towards All Might, unbalancing the car for a moment before he managed to stabilize it. But All Might wasn't smiling, he was just wordlessly frowning at Izuku. Even though he was confused, the feeling of his new quirk and the more potent feeling of victory was still rushing through his veins, and he wasn't worried. He turned back towards the pile of trash and lobbed the minivan at it. It went a bit further than he had intended and ended up hitting the top of the pile and sending an avalanche of junk down the slope. The car broke into two pieces, each half rolled down a different side of the pile before coming to rest with a crash. Normally accidentally throwing a car would concern Izuku, but right now it just made him laugh. As he watched the heap resettle itself, the feeling of power in his veins started to dissipate. Which was probably a good thing. He wanted somewhere without trash and rusted metal everywhere to practice moving around with his new quirk. He had the feeling it would be unpredictable. He'd make plans later, but at that point he just picked his way away from the trash pile towards All Might. When Izuku was around 10 feet from All Might, he spoke. "Oh well, I guess my worries were justified. What? Don't worry, we can try again tomorrow. This isn't an exact science. It's expected that we'd run into some problems." Izuku snapped his head up to look at All Might, then froze. Oh no. He had a guess as to what was happening. "It's impressive that you've built up such strength even without one for all, and I'm sure that once you inherit it you'll make a fine hero." Izuku stared back at him, unable to compose a single word. In one sense, this was an enormous victory for him. Izuku had long since believed in the existence of his quirk. He'd felt it deep in his core, even with the awareness that there was nothing external which he could use to verify it. He'd accepted that it was just something he'd experience forever while never being able to prove it. But here was that external evidence. Something outside of Izuku's mind which verified what he'd known for his entire life. Because his quirk, his original quirk, was still active. It was convincing All Might that Izuku hadn't inherited one for all. But it wasn't like it could keep doing that. His original quirk couldn't be that powerful. If he used one for all enough, logic would overpower whatever control his quirk had over All Might. He could work past this, it was just a temporary roadblock. Right? Minute. All Might stood by Izuku's side in his thin form with his arms wrapped around his torso. He was biting his lip and tilting his head to the right. "Young Midoriya, I truly can't tell you why this isn't working." Izuku threw up his hands and glared at the sky. "But why was this happening?" "I know you're frustrated," All Might said. "I'm frustrated too. But we need to keep our heads on and work on figuring out how to pass one for all on to you." Izuku gestured emphatically at half of a minivan, which was mostly buried in the sand. 60 feet away. "Yes, your throwing arm is quite impressive," All Might said, waving one hand in the air and running his other hand through his hair. His fingers dislodged his bangs from their normal spot and left them awkwardly hanging over the top of his head. Izuku let his hands drop to his sides and worked on keeping the frustrated noise in his throat from escaping. Last night All Might had given Izuku one more hair to eat, which Izuku had reluctantly done. He'd hoped it would be enough to overpower the control that his quirk had over All Might. Izuku had been wrong in that hope. But it wasn't like this was his last chance. All Might wouldn't give up on trying to pass him one for all anytime soon. Izuku just had to figure out how to get around his quirk. All Might combed his hands through his disheveled hair, then carefully plucked a few hairs. "I would like to stay longer, but I don't know what else we can do today. Just try eating these over the next couple of days. I don't know if all that we're missing is quantity, but we'll try." All Might handed Izuku the hairs and started towards the road with wave that didn't quite match the hero's normal energy. "How about we meet Tuesday? An hour after we'd normally start training." While he was sure leaving quick, he was probably feeling guilty or something. All Might had a tendency to do that. Izuku absently nodded at his retreating back. He shook out his hands and bounced on the ball of his feet, trying to disperse some of the frustrated energy building in his chest. What could he do to convince All Might that he'd inherited one for all? He had to figure out how to outsmart his quirk. It wasn't like it was some all-powerful force. Every quirk had some sort of activation system that could be disrupted, or some drawback that could be exploited. He just had to think it through. What did he know about his quirk? Izuku loped over to his gym bag and rummaged through it until he found a pencil and his quirk analysis notebook. He sat down in the sand and opened it to a blank page. He titled the page "What I Know," then started to write out his thoughts in an attempt to keep them organized. His quirk's basic function was to make the people around him perceive him as quirkless, while also making sure that he knew he had a quirk. The first part of this his quirk did through two methods. First, a small physical mutation that gave him an extra toe joint that mimicked what a quirkless person would have. Second, subtle mind control. It didn't control the actions of the people around him. It didn't even affect their memories. It was more subtle in a way. All it did was take whatever they experienced and hit-wired their logical thinking to make them come to the conclusion he was quirkless. The activation his voice, when people heard him talk, his quirk would plant an anchor on them. After that it was able to disrupt their logical thinking. The second part of his quirk was why he was able to figure this all out in the first place. His quirk gave him information about itself through the images. They were essentially packets of information about his quirk. The point of them was to make sure that he knew he really had a quirk, since otherwise he would just think he didn't have a quirk like everyone else. Izuku looked over what he had written as he chewed on the end of his pencil. What could he do with this information? Nothing really stuck out to him as an easy solution. But there had to be something. What would his quirk be weak against? For one, quirks that gave the user information about quirks and ones that stopped other quirks from working. Izuku jotted that down in a corner. He looked over the page for anything he could have missed, but no really good ideas came up. He could try and avoid talking to All Might? No, that wouldn't help. His quirk already had an anchor on him. All that Izuku could think to do was to just keep working on using One for All. Eventually solid proof would have to overpower his quirk's control. It didn't feel like that good of a plan, but for now it was all Izuku had to work with. He snapped his notebook closed and bounced back to his feet, brushing the sand from his shorts. He dropped his notebook into his gym bag. He was filled with a sort of restless energy that dissuaded him from going home. So he stretched his arms. He still didn't have any concrete ideas, but he had a direction to go in. Izuku stretched his legs, looking around the mostly clear beach. There were a few people, but it was a bit too cold out to visit the beach. This would work for what he had in mind. Izuku stood up straight, closed his eyes, breathed deep, and clenched his butt. One for All crackled through his veins. Izuku loosened his posture, bending his knees and letting his arms hang at his sides. Then he started to run. It started smoothly, but he quickly realized he'd misjudged how much space he had and almost sent himself tumbling straight into the waves. He managed to stop himself a few feet from the surf, getting his shoes damp but avoiding getting soaked. Okay, so he could go really fast. He just had the problem of going too fast to be able to control his movement. Nothing a few hours of practice wouldn't fix. By Tuesday Izuku would be able to do something that would convince All Might that he'd inherited One for All. Izuku planted his feet firmly with his right foot behind him and his left foot in front. He half-crouched and lifted his arms into ready positions. He looked forwards, narrowing his eyes and carefully lining up his shot. He flexed his knees a few times, then took a deep, steadying breath. Izuku flung his leg out in a sudden, fluid kick. A burst of kinetic force shot out from his foot and surged towards the pile of trash 20 feet away. It hit so hard that some of the rubble exploded upwards almost a dozen feet. Izuku let out a breath and leaned back onto his heels, grinning at the rubble. Try making your kick rounder so that you have more time to gain momentum. You're just going straight at it and it's not giving your leg enough time to gain speed. All Might said, ping his head to the side. I congratulate you on your strength, but there are things I need to talk to you about. Izuku jerked backward, his mouth fell open and he stared at All Might. I'm going to try and get in touch with someone who knew the previous holder of One for All. He actually looked quite nervous at the concept. Izuku was a bit curious but was too startled with the situation to ask about it. He hasn't answered his phone or email, so I'm going to go to him to ask him for advice in person. I don't know how long it'll take. I'll tell you what I find as soon as I find it. Izuku felt a wave of frustration bubble up in the back of his throat. Before All Might had shown up, Izuku had practiced for 2 hours to launch that kinetic kick with the power that he'd just managed. He'd been sure that it would be enough to override his quirk's influence over All Might. But here the hero was still sure that Izuku hadn't inherited One for All. Maybe Izuku should try a more direct approach? Hey, All Might, Izuku said. The hero nodded. Are you sure that I didn't inherit One for All? I mean, I'm doing some pretty strong things here. Izuku gestured at the pile of trash he destroyed from 20 feet away. No, my boy. You underestimate your own natural strength. All Might shook his head and patted Izuku's shoulder. The transfer didn't work. We need to work on figuring this out, not asking hypothetical questions. But are you absolutely Sir Dash? Midoriya. Izuku sighed. He'd let it rest for now. He had to figure this out, but he needed to be careful about how he did it. From experience, he knew that trying to convince someone he had a quirk usually ended badly. He had to be careful to avoid misstepping. But he couldn't just leave All Might to think that One for All had failed to pass over. He didn't want to do that to someone who had given him such a valuable tool. He just needed to keep working on it. Izuku sat in the booth of the all-day breakfast diner and poked at what was left of his dinner. He'd shown up half an hour before All Might had said to meet him. In part because the last time they'd gone to the diner All Might hadn't been able to eat, and partially because Izuku wanted to stay away from his house. The last few days had put him on edge and made him temperamental. He didn't want to get in a fight with Mom just because he was mad about something unrelated to her. Izuku was pretty curious as to what the meeting was about. Yesterday, All Might had sent Izuku a cryptic text saying that he talked to his predecessor's friend and that it would be better if they were to talk in person. What had they told All Might? What about it made him hesitant to just text or call Izuku and tell him? Izuku didn't think whatever it was would actually be helpful, but he was curious nonetheless. The mystery was enough to bring him out of the emotional slump that he'd fallen into over the past week. He used his fork to move crumbs into a pile and hummed in the back of his throat. How much time did he have left to wait? He pulled out his phone. It read 6, so 3 minutes left. So taking All Might's general habits into account, he would be here at any moment. Izuku turned in his seat to get a better view of the entrance. All Might didn't walk through. That was odd. He normally timed himself to be consistently just a hair early. It wasn't that Izuku was offended when someone was late to something, it was just odd that All Might was breaking pattern like that. Izuku continued to watch the entrance for a few minutes before All Might appeared, several minutes after 7. This was the first time Izuku had ever seen him late for something. He walked through the front door in his skeletal form, looking even more slumped down than he normally did. Izuku waved him over, and as he got closer, Izuku noticed deep frown lines creasing his face. Had something happened? My apologies, All Might said, folding into the seat opposite Izuku. His voice sounded strained. It was impolite of me to make you wait like this. Izuku noticed he didn't say why he'd been late. Had something actually happened? Izuku decided to bring it up later. That's all right, Izuku said with a shrug. What was it you wanted to talk about? All Might let out a puff of air and his head dipped forwards. Is something wrong? Izuku asked, feeling slightly worried. All Might looked uncharacteristically defeated. It seemed wrong to describe All Might like that, but that's what it looked like. Nothing is wrong, my boy, All Might said, face still covered by his drooping bangs. There's just some bad news I need to give you. Take your time, I guess? Izuku wasn't really sure what to do with this. It was probably about passing One for All. Since that had already happened, Izuku wasn't worried about it, but All Might's expression was getting to him. A few moments passed in silence. I'm sorry, my boy, All Might said, voice subdued. I need to break my promise to you. That sounded ominous. Izuku had a feeling he wasn't going to like this. All Might looked up at Izuku. His black-ringed eyes were aged and sad, unlike anything Izuku had seen on the hero before. I made a promise to the bearer of All for One before me that I would continue the legacy she left behind. All Might kept his voice low. Izuku wasn't sure if it was for the sake of privacy or just because he couldn't say this any louder. I have a responsibility to pass on this quirk. But I don't have long to do that. I've spent valuable months training you to be my successor. Months I don't regret. But I'm under even more pressure to find a successor now than I was 5 months ago. All Might let his head dip forwards again. His long hair fell back down, covering his face. I need to try and find someone else who can inherit one for all. Izuku's hand tightened around his fork, then he flinched as it snapped in two. He felt energy crackling through his veins and realized he must have activated one for all accidentally. He forced the energy to dissipate. All Might snapped his head up at the noise and winced when he saw the two halves of the fork laying by Izuku's hands. Then he looked to the side and continued talking. An old sidekick who I trust suggested someone to me. A second year at UA. All Might normally had a very good poker face, but right now he didn't seem to be capable of one. His breathing was slightly uneven and every time he paused he bit his bottom lip and crumpled the space between his eyebrows. I'm going to arrange a meeting through my old sidekick. But I didn't want to do that without first telling you. All Might was giving up on taking Izuku on as a successor? Izuku felt his face slacken and he slumped bonelessly against his chair. All Might didn't think Izuku could be a hero. Izuku had trained for months and for years before that to gain this quirk. But even the man who'd given it to him didn't think that Izuku's effort had done anything. Something swirled in his gut, some furious and dark feeling. Izuku had taken All Might's quirk, but the hero didn't know. He was going to try and find another successor. Izuku lifted his eyes from his plate. All Might avoided his gaze, uncomfortably wrapping his arms around his torso and staring to the side. Izuku's anger stilled and was replaced by something thick and hopeless. He took in a few deep breaths, trying to steady himself, blinking his eyes a few times to hold back the tears that were threatening to form. Why dash? His voice broke on the word and he took a moment to calm himself. Why did you give up so quickly? I'm sorry, but you simply didn't inherit one for all. I'm running out of time to find a successor. I need to make the most logical decision. How do you know this is the best decision? Izuku said, doing his best to keep his voice even. How do you know I didn't inherit one for all? You didn't, All Might said with a frustrated exhale of breath. Izuku had to stop for a moment to strengthen his voice. He couldn't afford to sound anything less than entirely confident and trustworthy. But how do you know? I mean, look at the things I've done. I threw half a minivan 60 feet. That isn't something that a person can do through just natural strength. My boy, All Might said with his skeletal face hardening. I've told you that you were underestimating your strength. There is a line between humility and self-deprecation, and attributing your hard-earned strength to a quirk crosses that line. This isn't something under debate. You didn't inherit one for all. But how do you know? Izuku insisted, leaning forward and planting his palms on the table. He knew that this probably wasn't the best way to convince All Might that he had a quirk. But he couldn't think of a good way to do it. He just had to keep pushing. Maybe there's just some outside force that's making it harder for you to believe it? Midoriya. All Might snapped, face hardening and eyebrows crumpling. He unfolded his arms and leaned towards Izuku, finally looking him in the eye. His words were dripping with regret, but they were quick and much louder now. I really do know that I've completely failed you, but this will be easier for you if you just accept that the transfer didn't work. But how do you know for certain? Izuku responded, just as loud. You know that I'm doing things that require much more strength than a person naturally has. I'm sorry, All Might shouted. It's not your fault that you didn't inherit one for all. But you didn't. Stop apologizing. Izuku insisted, his tone was too sharp. You didn't fail me. I inherited one for all. You need to listen to Dash. Excuse me, but I'm going to have to ask you and your son to leave, said a firm voice. Izuku snapped his head to the side and recognized the server from before. She was staring All Might right in the eyes. Izuku realized that the restaurant had gone silent. The worried faces of other diners were staring at All Might and him. Oops, seemed they'd gotten pretty loud. Of course, All Might muttered, ducking his head. We'll be right out. Izuku snatched up his bag and stalked out of the booth. He didn't trust himself to apologize without sounding angry, so he didn't try. He quickly reached the entrance and slipped through. All Might slipped out a moment later. The chilly night air settled around them and a heavy silence came with it. Izuku slumped his shoulders and dug his hands into his pockets. He looked out towards the street. It was mostly empty, though a few pedestrians wrapped in heavy coats hurried along the sidewalks. There were a few street lights scattered around, but even without them, it wouldn't be that dark out. There was a blanket of clouds covering the sky, catching the light from the ground before it could escape and casting the street in orange half-light. Izuku dug his neck into his hoodie as the night air brushed against it. It was utterly silent other than the soft sound of distant traffic. Izuku wasn't sure what he should do. He knew this wasn't All Might's fault. But at the same time he didn't trust himself to talk calmly yet. So they stood side by side for a few minutes. Izuku saw All Might opening his mouth to say something a few times, but he never followed through. Izuku wasn't really angry at All Might. It wasn't his fault that Izuku's quirk was getting into his mind. If anything, Izuku was angry at his quirk. Being angry wasn't going to solve Izuku's problems though. What could he do? How could Izuku fix this? He stared at his breath as it fogged in the air. From the cold. It held no answers. All Might's plan didn't really seem like something he would have come up with. All Might was smart and could make tactical decisions that lead to someone being hurt if the situation demanded it. But he never would have come up with the idea of giving Izuku up as a successor. It could have been the person that All Might went to talk to. It wasn't something that Izuku could know for certain though. He just didn't have enough information. Izuku didn't have any answers. Standing out here in the cold wouldn't do All Might any favors though. Even with the large coat he had on, the hero looked thin. Just looking at him made Izuku feel cold. All Might, Izuku said, breaking the silence. He tried and failed to make eye contact. I can't stop you from doing this, and I won't try to. You can try to give it to someone else, but I don't think it will work. He kept his voice steady, but there was still a lump of emotion clogging his throat. Thank you, young Midoriya, All Might said, slumping his shoulders and letting out a breath of air. Remember, I'm not giving up on you. I'll still train you to get through the entrance exam, even if you aren't my successor. Izuku tried to think of something to say, some comfort to offer All Might, but words failed him. The silence came down onto them once again. Was there any reason to stay now? Izuku knew All Might wouldn't leave first. He would probably stand here in the cold all night in some misplaced attempt to make Izuku feel better. That wouldn't make All Might any healthier though. Izuku took a step forward, tilting his head to catch All Might's gaze. Izuku nodded at him and managed to give him a half smile that maybe looked kind of genuine. Then he gave All Might a small wave and walked away. There really was no reason to stay, and hopefully, All Might would go somewhere warm as soon as he wasn't motivated by guilt to stand next to Izuku. Izuku let the sand sift through his listless fingers. It fell silently to the ground. The only sound was the beating of the waves on the beach and the soft sound of the night wind winding through the sky. Izuku took a deep breath of the salty air and let his head drop backward. Above him was an intricate splatter of delicate stars in an infinite inky void. Inside, Izuku was furious. His anger swirled through him like a storm. It kicked and pulled, demanding to escape. It took all of his self-control to keep from screaming at the silent beach. He let his head drop forwards, cradling it in his shaking hands and taking in unsteady breaths. Izuku had thought that going here would help him calm down, but all that it had done was grown the anger that was now blocking his throat. He needed to go home, he knew that. But he couldn't do it like this. He didn't want to risk saying something that he'd regret to Mom. She didn't deserve that. Izuku just didn't know what to do. Not right now, not how to fix this entire situation. He felt lost. Needed to go blow off steam somewhere. He didn't want to stay at the beach. But where would he be allowed to go work out this late at night? Though, now that Izuku thought about it, it wasn't really a question of where he would be allowed to go, so much as where he could get into. Izuku had an idea. Izuku punched with every ounce of his strength, channeling the frustration building in his chest into his fist and driving it forward with all the momentum he could conjure. The punching bag jumped off its hook and went flying, sailing through the air before landing with a heavy thump in the far corner of the gym. Izuku shook his hand out, letting out a hiss at the sharp pain from his knuckles. He looked down at his fingers and winced. He'd forgotten to wrap his hand before he'd started punching, which was a good way to break a knuckle. He examined his hand for a few moments, twisting it back and forth. His knuckles were bloody and probably on their way to bruising, but they weren't all that bad, which was lucky. He should have wrapped them when he started punching 20 minutes ago. He could have hurt them badly if he'd kept going without them wrapped. Stupid mistake. Though it wasn't like he was at his most focused right now. He crouched and dug around in his gym bag until he found his hand wraps. He took a few minutes to carefully wrap his hands. Once he was done, he trudged over to the punching bag, picking it up and swinging it over his shoulder. Then turned back to the center of the room. His insides felt like a swirling mess. The past week had been the emotional roller coaster of a lifetime. A week ago, he'd felt like he was on the top of the world. He finally had an actual useful quirk. He was at the same starting line as everyone else who was gunning to be a hero. But of course, his original quirk got in the way. Izuku twisted the punching bag's chain in his hands, squeezing his eyelids shut and taking in a deep, shaking breath. What was going on with him? He was never this emotional. He'd accepted that people would think of him as quirkless, that people wouldn't believe he could be a hero. What had happened? Why couldn't he just get over All Might not wanting him as a successor? He'd been alone in believing he could be a hero before. Why was losing his spot as All Might's successor so painful? Well, he knew why. Izuku had begun to rely on the hero's support. Izuku could try and bring back the apathy he had in the past. Try to bring himself to completely ignore how everyone thought he was quirkless, how they thought he was useless. It didn't matter, he would be a hero regardless of what they thought of him. But he couldn't do it. This was All Might. His childhood hero. He was the one who thought Izuku was good enough to be a hero, good enough to be the #1 hero's successor. But as of today, that faith in him was gone. He didn't want to think about that. He didn't want to think about anything right now. He strung the punching bag. Back up, steadied it, and took a step back. He took the time to line himself up perfectly, perpendicular to his target, feet just wider than shoulder width apart, shoulders squared, forearms up in defensive box around his torso. He sprung forwards and hit the bag with his right fist. This time he didn't try for strength, just worked on keeping his form perfect. Then he stepped back and did it again. And again. Don't think about everyone's expectations of him, their expectations that he'll fail at everything he wants to do. Izuku switched to hitting with his left hand. Don't think about the fact that All Might would never stop feeling guilty about this. Izuku switched to series of quick punches, alternating which hand he used each time. Don't think about All Might's ragged breathing, about his bangs hanging limply in front of his eyes. The world started to blur and shift around Izuku, but he just punched harder. Don't think about All Might's ragged breathing. Izuku took a step back to reset, forcing himself into perfect form. Don't think. When his fist connected, the punching bag burst apart and sprayed scraps of cloth and sand across the gym floor. He stood there breathing hard, ears ringing. In a distant way, he felt the buzzing of energy in his veins. He must have activated one for all while he'd been distracted. He consciously forced it to dissipate. Looking at it more objectively, this may not have been the best way to blow off steam. He figured going to a gym and doing a workout would help. It had not. He'd done his normal workout twice over before turning to the punching bag, but he still couldn't find any of his normal balance and calm. He tilted his head toward the ceiling and pressed his hand to his eyes, then jerked them back at the jolt of pain he felt. He opened his eyes to see blood seeping through both his hand wraps. He'd overdone it. He should have stopped at the punching bag when he first saw blood on his knuckles. He sighed. It was too late for that now though. Actually, how late was it? There was a clock in the gym, but as it was currently hidden in the shadows, he had no idea what it said. He trudged to his bag and slipped his phone out of a pocket, then winced. 1:39 a.m. He'd had no idea that it was that late. He was way too out of it to be working out right now. He scrolled down on his screen and almost dropped his phone as he saw his notifications. There were multiple texts and calls from Mom. He'd never told her where he was. She must be worried sick. He'd set his phone on vibrate during his talk with All Might, then he'd never turn the sound back on. Izuku had to text her. She'd definitely want to know where he was. He really didn't want to tell Mom that. He ran a hand down his face and sighed. He looked at the clock again. 1:40 a.m. He should get out of the gym and get home. He didn't think anyone would show up here, but he didn't want to be there if someone did come. Sure, he knew the owner of the gym from his martial arts classes. but she'd never given him a key. He'd gotten in through an unlocked window, but that was still basically breaking and entering. Though, looking around the gym, Izuku knew he wouldn't be able to hide the fact that someone had been here. There were scraps of cloth and grains of sand scattered across the floor from the punching bag he'd accidentally destroyed with One for All. Even if Izuku cleaned up what was left of it, she would still notice that one of her punching bags was missing. Izuku belatedly registered that he'd just destroyed someone's punching bag. He needed to do something about that. A punching bag like that would cost at least 10,000 yen, right? He didn't have that much on him, he should just come back at some point and leave that much for her to find. He didn't want to just leave the scraps from the punching bag just spread around the room. He grabbed the broom from a supply closet and started sweeping the sand into a pile. He systematically started brushing the sand to a single point, trying to be as efficient as he could. But it took a long time to get everything together. It had been one of the 50-kilo bags. There was a lot of sand to move. It was thoughtless, mind-numbing work, but it helped him to stamp down the emotions swirling around inside him in a way that working out hadn't done at all. So at least this little breaking and entering escapade had been kind of helpful. He still felt terrible, just more like he was in control of how terrible he felt. He sighed and wiped down the broom of his fingerprints. Then stashed it back in the closet without touching it with his fingertips. After that he went through the workout equipment he'd used and wiped down the machines with the towels the gym had around. Partially because it was good gym etiquette and partially for Prince. It didn't hurt to be careful. He was still angry, but instead of being a fiery and all-consuming fire, it was now a smoldering core of frustration. Not that he was angry directly at All Might, not only at him anyway. He was the victim of this situation. Izuku was more frustrated at his original quirk. It didn't really make sense to be angry at an inanimate part of himself, but he still was. He hadn't thought that his quirk would try and hide One for All. He hadn't really thought about what it would do, he just assumed that it would keep doing the same thing, keep hiding the fact that it existed at all. But his original quirk had changed when he'd gained a second quirk. It had grown into something that resembled how it was before, but much more powerful and with an increased ability to assess situations. Izuku stumbled. That hadn't been something that he'd thought. That had been an image. That was unexpected. He hadn't had an image pop into his head for more than a year now. At some point it had just stopped, he'd assumed because his quirk thought it had told him everything he needed to know. But if his quirk was changing, it would have more to tell him. That was weird though, he'd heard of people's quirks changing, but most of the time it was just that the user had a new way to use them. It was probably just a side effect of One for All. He decided not to worry about it. He considered what the image had said though, and that explained it. His quirk had changed. And consequently there was new knowledge that he needed about his quirk, so it started talking again. It was doing it differently though. When it had tried to tell him things in the past it had always shown him one image, then flooded him with way too many images afterwards. This time it just gave him one image, then quieted down. The image said it had increased ability to assess situations. That would suggest it now knew that giving him too many images wasn't helpful. So it turned out that his quirk was just originally, what? Miscalibrated? The design of the quirk was just internally faulty. So he had a glitchy quirk and gaining One for All had updated it. Even ignoring its small glitches, his quirk was pretty terrible in terms of its general effect on him. All it did was give him the social ostracization that came with being quirkless while making sure he knew that everyone was mistakenly socially ostracizing him. He'd have time to think about that more later though, for now he had to get a move on. He pulled his phone from his bag and winced. First at the time, 2:05 a.m., and then at the notification list. He still needed to text Mom back. Even though he felt guilty about worrying her, he was glad he'd gone to the gym instead of going straight home. He had a feeling that if he'd gone home to Mom before giving himself a chance to tamp down his emotions, he would have gotten in a shouting match with her. Not something he was keen to do, especially not after what happened with All Might earlier. Izuku knew Mom would have preferred he had gone directly home. She was probably worried sick. Yeah, he felt bad about that now. He needed to reply. Sorry, I just saw all these, I'm safe. I'm heading home, I'll be back in under 20 minutes. She responded immediately. Izuku, are you okay? What happened? Where are you? She must have been awake and waiting for him to respond. Yeah, he felt really bad now. He should respond though. He didn't want to tell her that he'd broken into a gym though. What could he tell her that wouldn't make her worry? I'm so sorry, I was frustrated with some drama and was at the gym late working off steam. I know the owner, so she let me stay after she closed up shop and left. I had my phone on silent and I ended up falling asleep. I just woke up and saw this. I'm so sorry for worrying you. Falling asleep was a bit of a lame excuse, but it seemed believable enough. Plus it had a vague resemblance to the truth. I could come pick you up. What's the address? Izuku felt bad again. For staying out late and for lying about it. He'd have to make this up to Mom somehow. Don't worry, it's close, I'm be home in a bit. Izuku slipped his phone into his bag, ignoring the notification sounds, and zipped it up. Then he carefully climbed out the unlocked window of the gym, clicking it closed behind him. He belatedly glanced around, but there was no one in sight. It would take a while to get to his house if he were to walk, or even run, but he had a better way to get home. He took his gym bag and stuck his arms through the straps, wearing it like the backpack it was not designed to be. He took a deep breath and called up his power. Its crackling energy filled him up and made the world around him snap into focus. He took a step backwards, then sprung upwards towards the roof 2 stories up. He snagged the eaves with both hands and hauled himself up. He glanced around to get a sense of where he was, rubbernecking around until he saw a building he knew to be in the direction of his apartment. Then he was off, jumping from rooftop to rooftop like some silent humanoid ninja bouncy ball. The gym was at least 2 miles from his house, but it only took him a couple minutes to cross the distance. Once he was within a block of his apartment, he let himself drop down from the rooftops into an alley. A few moments later he stepped onto the street, adjusting his clothes from the wind and pulling his arms out from his gym bag straps. He walked the last block back to his apartment. It was otherworldly walking around so late. Or so early. Regardless, it was strange. The normal sounds of the neighborhood were absent. The air tasted crisp but uninviting. The inconsistently spaced street lights turned some parts of the street a grungy yellow and other parts into shadowy recesses. He wasn't sure if he liked it or not. He couldn't wait around and take the time to decide though. He had to get back home. Once he reached the stairs, he bounded up them 3 at a time until he reached his floor. He could have taken the elevator, but that would have been slower. He made his way down the hall till he reached his door, then knocked lightly. The door shot open and Mom stared at him breathlessly. She paused for a moment, eyes wide and apprehensive, then she let out a heavy breath and pulled him into a tight hug. Izuku hugged her back. He still thought that burning off some of his anger before coming home to Mom had been a good idea, but that didn't mean that he wasn't feeling incredibly guilty about worrying her. She pulled her face backward, pulling his head down to her level and looking at his face to make sure he was okay. Izuku. Oh, Izuku. Her eyes were watering and she was talking in a whisper. Are you okay? I was so worried. I tried calling the police, but they said that until you'd been missing 2 days they couldn't do anything. Oh, she'd called the police? He should have listened to the voicemails or read the texts. Time to reassure her though. I'm okay, Mom. I'm so sorry for worrying you. I promise I was never in danger. Alright. You don't look too good though, are you sure? Something didn't happen? She swept a thumb under his eyes. Were you crying? Are you okay? Yeah, I'm okay. He'd cried today? It must have been while he was at the gym and he just hadn't realized it. Was it that drama that you talked about? Drama? Oh yeah, in the text that he sent her. Yeah, that. He pulled his face into a weary smile. Oh, Izuku, she said, calming down a little and letting go of him. You fell asleep? You were safe though, right? The doors to the gym were locked? The owner of the gym knew you were there. Yeah, of course. Izuku lied. Oh, thank goodness. Mom reached behind Izuku and shut the door. I think I aged 5 years just out of worry. She rounded on him, jabbing a finger in his face, switching from worried to disappointed in a moment. You have to promise that from now on you're going to call me whenever you're planning on being out late. Even if it's just a workout. Of course I will, Izuku said easily. I promise something like this won't happen again, but I'll try to keep you in the loop anyway. Thank you, sweetie. She patted him on the arm, switching from disappointed to friendly as fast as she'd switched moods a moment ago. Then straightened up. "Oh, you must be hungry. I'll make you something as a late-night snack. You don't have to dash." "Nonsense. It'll just take a minute. Just sit down at the table and wait." She hurried over to the kitchen and started industriously pulling things out of drawers. Izuku followed her and started putting the dishes on the drying rack away. "Izuku, sit down." "Sorry, I'm a rebel." Izuku smiled at a ceramic bowl as he tucked it into a drawer. "I stay out late and I don't do what my mom tells me to." Mom snorted softly but let him stay in the kitchen. Izuku watched her from the corner of his eye. It was nearing 3 in the morning, but she was oddly energetic. There was a good chance it was just nervous energy on her part. Nervous energy she had because she was worried about Izuku. He felt guilty again. Once the dishes were put away, Izuku leaned against the counter and glanced around. He realized that he still had his knuckle wraps on. He checked under the sink but didn't see a familiar green bag. "Hey Mom, did you move the first aid kit?" She dropped the cardboard box she was holding and whirled towards him. "Are you hurt? What happened?" Suddenly she was worried Mom again. "I'm okay, I promise," Izuku said, holding out his hands to her. "I just went a bit too hard on the punching bag. I'll need a couple band-aids, that's all." She let out a deep breath, visibly deflating. She took a hold of his hands. He hadn't bothered to remove the wraps before leaving the gym, which was the only reason she hadn't already noticed. She let out a soft clicking sound as she turned his hands around, examining the faint spots of blood which were spreading across the cloth. Izuku looked away, not able to stomach at her expression any longer. This had happened often enough when he'd first begun to work out, before he'd built up calluses or good habits. She'd been the one to patch up his knuckles back then too. It was almost embarrassing that it had happened again now. It made him feel childlike, like she was insisting on tying his shoes or something. "Oh," she let out a breath of air, deflating a bit and holding a hand to her chest. "It's under the sink in the bathroom. Bring it here and I'll clean your knuckles for you." "It's okay, I can just do it myself." He tried to duck away from her to no avail. "Izuku," Mom said, tone discouraging any argument. It was the kind of voice that told Izuku this would be a losing battle on his part. So he raised his hands in surrender and retreated out of the kitchen. He made his way to the bathroom and crouched to extricate the first aid kit out from the mess that was their bathroom cabinet. After he was done, he stood back up and caught a glimpse of his face in the mirror. He paused. He looked terrible. His eyes were red and puffy and had deep dark bags under them. His hair was slicked to his head in some places from sweat and was unruly sticking straight upwards in other places. Which, come on? It wasn't even 2 inches long and it was a total mess? He could see the places where sweat had dried on his clothes. No wonder Mom didn't let him make food for himself. Izuku took a few moments to splash water on his face. He didn't look that much better. He plodded out of the bathroom and back into the kitchen. Mom nodded at him from the table, where she was sipping tea from a mug and nibbling on a piece of toast. She looked more tired than she had just a minute ago. Her eyes had subtle bags under them and her hands were trembling slightly. So it had been an adrenaline rush, which was now wearing off. Adrenaline rush at 2 in the morning. He set down the first aid kit, then sat down at the table and grabbed a piece of toast for himself from the plate of snacks Mom had laid out. As he took his first couple of bites, Mom pulled the first aid kit to her and pulled out some disinfectant and band-aids. She stood up and went to the kitchen, then came back a minute later with a bowl of water and a dish rag. Mom reached out for his left hand. Izuku held it out for her and she wordlessly unwrapped it. She was careful about it, much more careful than Izuku would have been. She made sure to not put pressure on Izuku's knuckles, and when it was unraveled to the point that the cloth she was pulling off was touching skin, she slowed down considerably to avoid pulling on any broken skin. When she pulled off the last bit away from where it was tied around Izuku's thumb, she paused for a minute. Her mouth thinned to a flat line and her eyebrows twisted into an expression Izuku couldn't identify. It seemed sort of sad, but at the same time angry. It made something in his gut twist uncomfortably to see her so clearly unhappy. After a few moments, he wrenched his eyes away from her face and to his. The skin around his knuckles was torn and slightly bloody, though it seemed like the hand wrap had absorbed most of the blood. The bleeding had mostly stopped, his ring finger and pinky were both mostly scabbed over. Izuku thought it wasn't that bad. He'd seen people break their hand from using a punching bag without properly wrapping their knuckles. A couple scrapes were the best outcome as far as he was concerned. He definitely shouldn't tell Mom that. Mom sighed, dipped the rag in the bowl, wringed it out, then used it to wipe the blood off of Izuku's hand. Once the blood was gone, she used a spray on disinfectant to clean it. It hurt, not that much since it hadn't had a chance to get infected, but it still stung. Then she stuck brightly colored band-aids anywhere it was still bleeding, and some places where it was done bleeding. Mom let go of his left hand and reached out for the other. He obliged her and she restarted the process. Once both his hands were uniformly covered in neon band-aids, Izuku stood up and cleared off the table before Mom could do it. By the time Mom bemusedly followed him into the kitchen, packed up first aid kit in hand, he'd already cleaned up. Izuku wrapped Mom in one last hug as she entered. "I'm going to take a shower, then sleep until noon," he told her. "Oh, thank goodness," she said, softly snorting. "I wasn't going to say anything, but you smell like last week's trash." "That's a little harsh," Izuku said, then let his mouth tick into a smile. What did last week's trash do to deserve that sort of comparison? "Oh, my little boy," she said, laughing quietly and shaking her head. She pulled his head down till she could kiss his forehead, which involved him crouching until his knees touched the ground, and then left the kitchen first aid kit in hand. Izuku stood in the kitchen for a minute after she left, staring out the window at the blackness outside. He shook his head and flipped the light switch. The room plunged into darkness and he blinked his eyes to regain some sense of sight. There was an odd feeling in his gut. After he'd been diagnosed with not having a quirk, he tried to convince Mom he was fine in lots of ways. He'd discovered the best method was to make a bad joke, and so he'd fallen into the habit of it. He knew it was kind of dishonest, but after she'd stopped worriedly asking about if he was making friends, he'd decided that it was worth it, even if it meant he never could tell her about the things he worried about. He needed a shower. Izuku headed out of the kitchen. Izuku blinked his eyes open, then twisted onto his stomach. Then winced at the pain that the motion caused. Then winced again as he remembered why he was so sore. He'd done his normal workout multiple times yesterday. That had been a mistake. At least he didn't have school today. There was no way he'd be able to focus on anything academic. Izuku pulled himself out of bed and stretched, which was rather painful but made him feel better, then stumbled to the bathroom. He flicked on the lights and blinked his eyes at the light, only to stop and stare when he saw his reflection. Had his shoulders always looked that big? His t-shirt was old, but it had definitely fit him better when he'd put it on last night, this morning. Whatever. He couldn't have grown that much in one night, could he? His power was increasing his physical growth so as to make his unusual strength more explainable. Izuku vaulted over the wall, landing in a soundless crouch. Going this way had become a habit. Bakugo had become even more intent on fighting Izuku since the whole thing with the sludge villain, and Izuku just didn't want to deal with that. He looked up and saw Purple looking at him with his normal half-closed eyes and half-dead expression. "Hey, you said you're planning on being a hero, right?" Purple blinked. "I did." "Yeah," Izuku said. "Do you want to do some training with me? My trainer and me had a falling out, but I still have a guest pass to my gym for the next 9 months. Purple blinked, this time with what Izuku thought was more enthusiasm. "Sure." "Great," Izuku said with a nod. "Meet me here tomorrow, same time. Wear workout clothes, the gym's about half a mile away." He walked down the stairs to what had once been a trash-covered beach. Rather than being covered by old refrigerators and microwaves, it was now filled with people. Izuku hadn't been here on a sunny day before. He definitely hadn't been expecting it to be this crowded. Well, he could ignore them. He walked to the water, but while he was still walking he started to get a strange feeling on the back of his neck. He looked around and realized that people were staring at him. Well, he didn't think he looked that out of the ordinary. Just another person on the beach. But the look in their eyes was strange. Was that pity on their faces? His quirk now anchored onto a person simply through the act of that person seeing his skin. All these people were pitying him for being some poor, quirkless kid. Damn it. Ignore. Ignore. Just practice moving around with one for all active. Izuku jumped over the fence, landing right in front of Purple. He should probably learn the guy's name at some point if he was going to train with him. He'd remember to learn it at some point. So, what kind of training have you done in the past? Purple looked at him with his baseline, done with this expression. Hello, I'm doing fine. Thanks for asking. How are you doing? Purple said, deadpan. Izuku stared at him. Purple snorted and looked to the side. Was that a smile at the corner of his mouth? Did the guy actually have emotions? Not that Izuku could talk. No. I haven't really trained before. I mean, I've gone on a few runs and I do PE. But that's about it. Purple said this like he'd practiced it, and Izuku got the distinct impression from the way that Purple's eyes fastidiously stayed just to the right of Izuku's face that he was interested in how Izuku would respond. He wasn't going to think about that though. He wanted someone to train with, someone who wouldn't take out a pillar of Izuku's life by leaving. Izuku nodded. Okay, I can work with that. Izuku turned towards the gym, already thinking through stretches. I'll talk you through how to properly warm up on the way there. Purple ambled along beside him. Izuku knew All Might said that going all out with one for all would be dangerous, but it couldn't be that bad, right? Besides, even if it was that bad, there were other people at the beach. Someone could call an ambulance for him if he ended up getting hurt. Izuku pulled his fist back, bringing his offhand into position and settling his weight solidly on the sand. Then he gathered all the strength that he could, letting go of the constraints that he'd set on himself and pulling as much power as he could into himself. Then he punched. For a moment the power rushed into his arm, like a river flowing through his veins. It was like pure energy welled up from deep in his chest and flowed into his hands. An incredible amount of force was channeled through his arm and tumbled towards the surf. Then the power stopped. It was like a hose was suddenly shut off. Izuku's punch went through, but it was like it only got a fraction of the power that it should have. The air moved and it let out a sound like thunder, but Izuku knew that it should have been more powerful. He could feel that there was more to grasp and use. But it felt like there was some sort of dam blocking him from actually using it. Izuku narrowed his eyes, looking down at his right wrist and rubbing it with his other hand. It was just on this side of hurting. There was the sound of people clapping from behind him. That didn't make sense though. All Might had said that it was entirely possible for Izuku to hurt himself using this power. But his quirk was limiting the output of his power so he couldn't injure himself. He could currently only use 5% of One for All's power. Seriously? Okay, stop for a second. Purple stopped. He was pretty good about listening to Izuku. The two of them barely talked at all, other than about training. This was their third training session and Izuku still didn't know what school the guy went to. He sort of liked that though. They didn't need to talk, they just worked towards a goal together. Right now we're only using light weights, but your knees are still going too far forwards. That's not harmful now, but once we move to heavier weights, that'll be all sorts of hell on your knees. Wait a second. Purple knew that Izuku wanted to be a hero. They'd been training for the exam for over a week now. Purple must think that Izuku doesn't have a quirk. After all, it only takes someone seeing his skin for his quirk to put an anchor on them. But Purple hadn't said a thing about how Izuku couldn't be a hero. That was a pretty great feeling now that he thought about it. You need to think about how the weight of your body is distributed so you can make sure your knees don't go beyond your toes. Purple went back to doing his back squats. His form wasn't great, but he was on his way to getting it. Izuku grinned. A thought struck him. What do you know about self-defense? Izuku asked with a half smile. Izuku could probably give him a few tips for the UA practical exam. Could I have your number? That'd make planning workouts easier, Izuku asked. Sure, give me your phone. Izuku handed it over. Unlock it? Izuku took it back. A minute of Purple silently tapping at Izuku's phone later, he handed it back. I sent me a text from your phone. I'll add your contact later. Your name is Shinso Hitoshi? Midoriya, really, you didn't know my name? Purple, well, Shinso, said with a hint of his sardonic smile. You know my name? Izuku didn't remember telling him. Yes, I do. Shinso raised an eyebrow at Izuku. I asked some kid from your school. Did you know just saying, guy who looks like a brick house but is weirdly fast, is enough for people to recognize you? Hello, Midoriya speaking. Young Midoriya. Izuku pulled his phone away from his ear. The caller ID said All Might. He probably should have checked that before answering. Or give All Might his own ringtone that Izuku could specifically ignore. That was mean. He might do it though. I have news. I told you what I was planning on doing the last time we met. All Might sounded upset, but Izuku couldn't read anything beyond that. Also, he was being vague. Probably meant the line wasn't secure and that Izuku shouldn't say anything too confidential. He should try and remember that. I made the attempt. But it didn't work. I have come to the conclusion that the thing which I was attempting to give you has a maximum amount of times that it can change hands. Izuku in air through his teeth. He'd known that this would happen. Didn't make him feel any less guilty though. I think that it would be best if we were to meet somewhere to discuss this. Izuku stared into space, considering. It wouldn't end well though. They'd just end up shouting at one another again. Izuku desperately wanted to work it out. Wanted to somehow convince All Might about his quirk. Work around it. Do something clever which solved everything. But Izuku had a lifetime of failures on this front behind him, and knew that there wasn't some miracle cure for the problem that defined his life. Izuku wouldn't be able to help, no matter what he tried. I don't think that would solve anything. Izuku could hear All Might's hurt through the silence on the other end of the line. If you so wish, Midoriya. A short pause. My offer is still open, of training you for the entrance exams without a quirk. That's generous. But no thank you. That may have been a bit icier than Izuku intended. It wasn't All Might's fault. Goodbye. Goodbye, young Midoriya. Good luck. Izuku hung up. It wasn't All Might's fault. Who was that? Izuku looked up at Shinso. He was looking at Izuku with an odd expression. A bit concerned actually. Izuku might have sounded, and looked, a bit more emotional than he intended. Nothing, just talking to my old trainer. It didn't end on the best note. Do you? Shinso paused. Don't want to talk about it? No, not really. It's not that big of a deal. It wasn't All Might's fault. It had been a month since he'd given Izuku one for all. It wasn't that unreasonable of him to try someone else if he thought that his quirk hadn't transferred to Izuku. Okay. Shinsu's eyes flicked around the room, then seemed to settle on something behind Izuku. Do you know that people always seem to be watching you, like no matter where we are? It's kind of weird. It was because pretty much everyone in the prefecture was certain that Izuku was quirkless and pitied him. His quirk now could create an anchor on someone just by them seeing him, so there were a whole lot more people who thought Izuku was quirkless than before. But it wasn't like Izuku could just tell Shinso that. Actually, that gave Izuku an idea. What if he could go somewhere where no one knew him? Then he could actually do some experimentation in how his quirk works, and what its limitations were. It would need quite a bit of setup, but it would be worth it if he could manage. Besides, it wasn't like it could go that much out of control. I'm home. Izuku called, unlocking the door. I brought my friend. There was the sound of someone dropping something. Izuku walked into the kitchen to see Mom with an expression almost like a fish before she schooled her face into something more controlled in time for Shinso to walk through the doorway. Sorry honey, you startled me, I dropped this. She was looking at the pile of glass shards near her slippered feet. It may have been some kind of dish, or perhaps a cup at some point. Pass me the trash can, I'll clean it up. Izuku handed it to her. Sorry, for being rude, darling. My name is Midoriya Inko, it's nice to meet you. She said, pulling shards towards her hand, then letting them drop into the trash can. How did you meet Izuku? Shinso said, looking moments away from wringing his hands. My name is Shinso Hitoshi. We're both hoping to get into UA. So we're training for it together. For the physical. Oh, that's nice. It must be fun to have someone to train with. Mom said with an easy smile. Shinso shot Izuku a glance out of the corner of his eye, which Izuku didn't bother trying to parse. Izuku, Could you make us something to eat? Mom said, not looking up from the glass that was clinking into the trash can. Shinso, what would you like to drink? We have water, milk, or coffee and tea if you're willing to wait. Waters would be great, thank you, Midoriya-sen. Izuku busied himself with making some snacks. He'd already finished his task for today. Mom knew Shinso, and knowing him, would like him well enough that she'd trust him. He let their talk wash over him, vaguely registering that they were talking about quirks. Shinsu's had something to do with mind control, with a speech trigger. That would be helpful in hero work. That would mean some incredibly clean villain takedowns. Izuku cut the celery into sticks a few inches long, setting some dip beside them, when he was distracted by the sound of sniffling. He looked up to see his mom hugging Shinso close as he cried into her shoulder. Izuku probably should have been paying attention. He did not know how to deal with someone crying. Thankfully, it seemed like Mom had it under control. Listen to me, young man, quirks are not what makes a villain. Actions are what makes a villain. Mom looked up and made eye contact with Izuku. There must be thousands of uses for mind control in a hero fight. Right, Izuku? This was something he could help with. If there was a situation where a villain had hostages, you could simply tell the villain to let them go. It would completely avoid any unnecessary casualties or injuries. You could stop a villain from destroying the streets faster than any physical hero simply by insulting them to get them to talk to you. You could calm down a crowd of panicked civilians, saving people that would otherwise be crushed. Shinso started crying harder and Izuku panicked for a moment, but then Mom gave him an approving smile, which meant that he'd said the right thing. Well, that worked out. For once, Izuku walked out through the front gates of school. The bell had rung less than a minute and a half ago, so he wasn't worried about Bakugo and his cronies showing up as he left. Over his shoulders, he had two bags. One was his school bag, the other the overnight bag he'd packed yesterday. In it was enough clothes for the weekend, some light non-perishable food, a few items he picked up from the store, and a bit of cash. He'd try and spend as little of it as he could. Hopefully, he could find a cheap room somewhere. He'd told his mom that he was staying at Shinsu's house. The two had never gotten each other's number, so the excuse should hold as long as Izuku kept giving her text updates. Time for a field trip. Izuku stepped off the train at the Kamino station, looking around at the dingy walls and flickering lights. Kamino had a bad reputation, so it wasn't strange that the stop would be so run down. It was still sad though. People lived here. Also, Izuku knew that the reputation was earned by Kamino having one of the highest crime rates of any area of Japan. Izuku wanted to do something to make this place better, but what could he do? It wasn't like he was able to help yet. He was going to make people feel safe. He needed to become the best hero possible. This trip was the first step. He was going to learn more about his quirk. Taking one last look around, Izuku promised himself that when he became a hero he would start cleaning up the streets. The first thing Izuku was going to do was test the principles of planting an anchor. In theory, it shouldn't be that difficult. He just has to figure out how much someone needed to see to think that he doesn't have a quirk. It wasn't as simple in practice. The most pressing problem was that showing no skin was kind of hard. It had taken him an entire afternoon of hitting thrift shops for him to find everything he needed, and even then, it wasn't the sleekest of solutions. He was wearing black pants and a gray sweatshirt, which was normal enough. However, on top of that he was wearing a black cloth ski mask that covered his neck, a pair of gloves, and a black fiberglass ski mask with tinted lenses. He was wearing a pair of black tennis shoes because he'd felt like his normal red ones would look ridiculous on top of everything else. He was sitting on a bench on the side of a well-trafficked road, waiting for someone who didn't look rushed to walk by. For some reason, people seemed to be favoring the other side of the street. But after around 10 minutes of waiting, someone approached him. It was an older woman and what looked like a police officer. The woman was walking a half-step behind the cop with a half-nervous, half-accusatory expression on her face. "Sir?" Izuku asked the officer. "Is something the matter?" Their expressions didn't change to pity the moment he opened his mouth. One point to his quirk now having a different trigger than it did in the past. "I'm going to have to ask you what you are doing here," he said. Izuku had a vague idea of what was going on. The lady called the cops on him, probably thinking that he was a villain waiting around before an attack. While the officer was pretty sure Izuku's just someone kidding around, or maybe had some quirk that required full body coverage. This worked just as well for what Izuku had planned though. He started fiddling with the cuff of his glove. "I'm just waiting for something, sir. Do you have ID on you?" he asked, not confrontational but with that peculiar sort of bored authority universal to experienced beat cops. That authority faltered as Izuku tugged at his glove. The woman also stopped her fidgeting to stare at the inch of Izuku's wrist that he'd just bared. There was a moment of staring, then their faces fell into an expression of pity. So, that meant that even the smallest amount of skin meant that people were hooked by the anchor, frustrating but enlightening. The officer started to talk again. Izuku readjusted his glove. When Izuku looked back up, the pair had already walked away. They were probably experiencing intense cognitive dissonance. 1 second, Izuku was some possible villain. Next, he was some dressed-up quirkless kid. There were probably some concerning implications that could be drawn from that. Izuku wasn't too worried. The real question was how he could use this. He stood up from the bench and headed down the street, towards his hotel. He probably could do more today, but he needed some time to think of further tests for his new discovery. He could probably use this to hide his real identity if it ever became necessary. Cover his skin completely and suddenly no one's going to recognize him. Izuku could use it if he ever needed to go undercover when he starts working as a hero. Strength was a common enough quirk that no one would raise an eyebrow at some unusually strong underground hero coming in to deal with a problem. If someone who'd already seen his skin saw him and didn't know it was him, would they still think he was quirkless? Izuku suddenly stopped. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled in response to something he couldn't quite place. He twists his neck around, trying to place the sensation. The feeling was coming from an alley to his right. He wasn't sure what it was, but there was some sound that was setting off his subconscious alarms. Izuku slipped into the alley, keeping his steps light and staying in the shadows of the buildings. As he edged around a dumpster, he was confronted with the sight of a man holding his arm around a child's throat. On the other side of the alley was a group of around a dozen children, the oldest being around 10 and the youngest maybe 4. They were dumping objects out of the various bags and backpacks they were wearing. All of them were dressed in layered second-hand clothing. Once the bags were empty, the oldest stepped in front of the others. She stood with a forced posture of confidence, watching the man with a calculating yet fearful gaze. The man sized up the items scattered across the alleyway. "That's all you have? Are you Dash?" Izuku coughed. Both the children and the man snapped their heads towards Izuku. All except the child in the man's grip, he remained perfectly still, though his eyes locked onto Izuku's. The kid's eyes were pale orange with no pupils. They stayed steadfastly focused on Izuku even as tears appeared around the corners of his eyes. "Listen. This isn't any of your business." The man snarled. "I don't care if you're some kind of new villain trying to prove yourself or whatever you are. This doesn't concern you." Izuku thought about trying to correct him. Izuku then considered the belongings spread around the ground around the man. The way the kid he had in his grip was holding unnaturally still. It didn't take him long to make his decision. Izuku flooded one for all into his legs and within an instant had twisted the man's arm backward and locked him into an unyielding sleeper hold. The orange-eyed child fell forwards and stumbled towards the rest of his group. Izuku flooded his arms with one for all. He kept an iron grip around the villain's neck until he stopped moving, then Izuku dropped him. He looked up at the kids. They didn't move backward, there was no space left for them to do so. The oldest one pushed a younger one behind her and forced her expression into one of confidence and calmness. "I'm not a villain," Izuku said, doing his best to keep his voice quiet and level. "You're dressed like one," she said, with the slightest tilt of her head. "Accident." "That's dumb," she said decisively. Izuku nodded. She loosened her tense shoulders and looked around at the objects scattered around the alley. The kids, on some unseen mutual consensus, swarmed forwards. They worked together to pack away the scattered belongings back into backpacks and bundles. One of the older ones walked right next to Izuku and patted the villain down. He stood back up with a concerning number of wallets. He handed one to Izuku. The ID matched the face of the man lying next to Izuku's feet. Izuku took the cash out from the man's wallet and held it towards the leader. He couldn't bring himself to feel bad. She came forward to take the cash from Izuku's hand, and he gave her a final nod. She nodded back. The group suddenly streamed out of the alley, moving on some unseen and unheard signal. Maybe one of them had a telepathy quirk. Maybe they just had been together a while. Izuku picked up the man and walked out to the street. It was a bit late, but there were still people out. He stood there with the man slung over his shoulders until he heard someone calling the police. Then he set the man down, setting his wallet, sans the cash, on his chest. Then, with a few carefully controlled bounds, he was out of sight. He stopped on a rooftop a few blocks from where he'd left the villain and slumped down onto a heating duct. That had been. Izuku didn't even know how to describe it. He hadn't thought, just reacted to what was going on. It had been exhilarating. Kind of terrifying. He'd been calm earlier, but now his lungs were doing some strange things. He couldn't quite get his breath back. That was super illegal. He'd used his quirk to attack someone. That was vigilantism, very much so. Could someone trace him to the crime? He hadn't bled and was wearing gloves. No one saw his face. The only people who got a good look at him were those kids, and he got the feeling they wouldn't be talking to the police. Besides, even if they somehow thought of something he didn't and found him, if they started to investigate him, they'd find the records of him being quirkless. If they saw him in person, they'd believe it. The definition of vigilante depended on quirk use, right? Suddenly Izuku had a thought. Well, it wasn't exactly moral. He was technically breaking laws since he really did have a quirk. But he wouldn't be hurting people. Well, he would, but he would be hurting the people who deserved it. It wasn't like police were incompetent. The pros weren't corrupt, at least, not in the ways that villains like Stain liked to preach about. But Izuku could give them a hand, couldn't he? It wouldn't hurt anything, would it? It would be good practice for him. He never got a chance to go all out. Wasn't really fair to do that to Shinso. Izuku was only just teaching him the basics of martial arts. Going against Izuku at full strength at this point just wouldn't be helpful for his progress. This could give Izuku a chance to know what it was like to fight in a situation with high stakes. Besides, he'd be helping to get the people who gave Kamino its bad reputation off of the streets. He could make people feel safer. Izuku took a few strides forward and jumped down from the roof, landing on the street with a thud. Where were the most dangerous parts of town, anyway? The night passed in a flurry of high-intensity encounters, each person he saved or fought blending into a single blurry memory of adrenaline and split-second decisions. Izuku punched the mugger's face with precision and carefully controlled anger. The man's nose breaking instantly under his fist. Izuku threw his phone. It hit the wall a few inches left of the woman's face. It was a warning, make a break for it and Izuku might break something of hers. The man with the shattered mask hanging around his neck stared at Izuku, breathing heavily and leaning against the wall to stay upright. He stared at the unconscious bodies around him with a mix of shock, disbelief, and thankfulness. Izuku stepped in front of a flying mailbox, protecting the pedestrians behind him. The woman who'd thrown it searched for something else to launch. Izuku leaped towards her before she could find more ammunition. Kamino apparently had a really high crime rate. The next day, Izuku went to an army surplus store and bought a pair of combat gloves. When he was there, his eye caught on a television screen. On it was one of the people he saved last night. She was staring into the camera with an almost haunted expression. The guy was threatening me, he had a gun. I don't think I had enough money, she said, voice unsteady. Then, out of nowhere, that vigilante showed up. It was terrifying. 1 second it was just the mugger, then he was there too. He moved so quickly, like some kind of teleportation quirk. But it worked faster than anything I've ever seen before. It was brutal. For a second I thought the mugger must have been dead from how quickly he went down. She paused, closing her eyes. Someone off-screen said something. She shook her head, then looked right at the camera. This vigilante, he might have been terrifying, but he saved my life. The video paused and faded out, revealing a woman sitting at a large desk. This is footage from an interview of one of the many people saved by the mysterious vigilante who appeared just last night in Kamino. Already he's been given the moniker the Black Bandit. Over the course of a single night, this vigilante took down no less than 16 known villains and an unknown number of petty criminals. Among those he saved was the recently graduated pro hero, Grim Glider, who has agreed to interview with us today. A hero decked out in full costume. Walked into frame, and yep, that was definitely the guy that Izuku had saved last night. This guy was a pro hero? Thanks for having me, the pleasure's all mine, he said, slipping into a chair with a smile half hidden by the mask that covered the top half of his face. When Izuku had seen him last night, his mask had been mostly shattered. Izuku assumed that the one he was now wearing was a replacement. So, let's get into what everyone wants to know, the newscaster said, leaning in. What happened when you encountered the Black Bandit? The interview went on for a few minutes, with Grim Glider explaining how Izuku had saved him from an alley full of inexperienced villains looking for a quick reputation boost. That was new. Grim Glider told the story of what had happened in the alley last night. Izuku thought he told the story with a little bit more emphasis on how dangerous the villains were than was accurate. But he still felt his face grow warm when Glider talked about how skilled of a fighter Izuku must be. The interview came to a close soon enough. Who is the Black Bandit? Why choose Kamino to act out his unlawful justice? How long will he remain at large? The newscaster asked the audience. In other news dash. Izuku turned away from the screen. It must be a slow day or something. Vigilantes rarely made the news. He had probably just accidentally picked a day where there was nothing better to talk about. Izuku wasn't going to stop, regardless. It might have been illegal, but taking down bad guys felt like he was doing something right. There was little ambiguity about what he should do. Well, ignoring the moral ambiguity of it all. But when the fight started, the only question of what he should do in a situation was whether he should go for a sleeper hold or a triangle choke. He wanted to know what people were saying about him in the hero message boards, but when he reached his hand into his pocket, all he came out with was a Ziploc bag of plastic shards. Oh yeah, that was all that was left of his phone. It wasn't that big of a deal. He and Mom had villain attack insurance that should cover a broken phone. Everything important was saved on his desktop anyway. Izuku kept the shards in a Ziploc bag though. He felt guilty for destroying it. One moment Izuku was sprinting across the rooftops, the next moment an inky mass appeared in front of him and he was on street level. He skidded to a stop and tried to regain his bearings. He was somewhere he didn't recognize. 30 feet away from him was that inky mass, swirling in a distinctly ominous way. Some sort of warp quirk? Sheet, it wasn't a hero he recognized. Some kind of villain attack launched against him because he was taking down villains? He started sprinting again. Maybe he'd get lucky and their quirk would have a cooldown time. If it did, he could get away from them before they could react. No such luck. After a few blocks, the inky mass reappeared in front of him and he found himself back on the same street. He skidded to a stop again. His choices were to talk himself out of it or fight the user of a warp quirk. Neither sounded very appealing, but they were his only options. Izuku slowly looked around. One of the buildings had a doorway with an unusually dark patch of shadow. He turned towards it and stood with his arms crossed. After a few moments of heavy silence, the darkness consolidated into the shape of a person wearing a formal suit. Beside him, a pale-haired man appeared. There was something strange about his appearance, and as he stepped into the moonlight, Izuku realized what it was. He was covered in hands. Not living hands. They looked kind of like they had been preserved. He had a pair on his arms, shoulders, and hair. And one stuck on his face, which was super gross. Handy walked towards Izuku until he was a few feet away. For some reason, he was holding a mug with his pinky extended, which Izuku felt was kind of counter to the whole intimidating villain look he was going for. The Black Bandit, huh? Handy said, ping his head. I'd shake your hand. But he brought his pinky down on the mug. Starting from the point of contact, it crumbled to dust. That made more sense. That also meant that Izuku now had to fight two villains with powerful quirks, rather than just one. A slightly hysterical part of his mind couldn't help but think about what a waste of a perfectly good mug that had been. Hopefully, plan it, talk them into not killing Izuku, would work. Izuku nodded at Handy, then at the warp guy who'd walked over to stand next to him. "You don't talk much, do you?" Handy tilted onto one foot and tilted his head to gaze at Izuku sideways. It probably would have been ridiculous if Izuku wasn't so worried about dying in the next couple of minutes. "I'm a little too busy for a chat." Izuku did his best to shift his voice into the best average adult male impression he could manage. No reasonable person would think Izuku was actually a middle schooler. His recent growth spurt had left him considerably taller than most adults. That, along with his vigilante getup, should be enough to hide his identity. "You hear this guy, Kurojairi?" Handy said with a laugh, dropping his air of seriousness. "He's a little busy. The guy spends 2 whole nights one-shotting every criminal in this city, and he's just busy." He pulled off the hand covering his face to reveal a concerningly wide and cracked smile along with a pair of blood-red eyes. "Wanna play video games?" Handy asked. Izuku's mind did something like what happens when a staircase is 1 stair longer than expected. It took him a moment to even realize that it's a question. One that he needed to answer. Izuku really didn't want to know what will happen if he said yes. However, he wanted to find out what would happen if he said no even less. "What game?" To Izuku's left, there was a silver-haired villain, one with the power to kill him with only the touch of his hand. To Izuku's right, standing behind a bar across the room, was a villain composed of black mist, one with the power to make Izuku's escape entirely impossible. Izuku was in a worn-down bar, which exuded an air of shady deals and questionable legality. It made perfect sense as a villain hideout. Rather incongruous to it all, just in front of Izuku was a TV on which he was playing Smash Brothers. Seriously? That was the game that this guy chose? What was this? A friendly sleepover between a couple of schoolboys? Izuku was a middle schooler, and even he knew that they should be playing something more thematic than Smash Brothers. Not that what video game they played made much of a difference. Izuku had never been much of a tech guy. He transitioned from online chat rooms to dojos around 10 years ago and had never really returned to games. Hopefully, having to ask what the controls were gave credit to the impression of Izuku being an adult. They'd played a few rounds, and pretty much the whole time Izuku just kept dying over and over. He wasn't really sure how the scoring worked, and he kept on getting confused about what character he was. Not that Izuku was all that concerned about actually winning. Handy seemed quite distracted with beating the computer characters that he spawned rather than caring about what Izuku was doing. Izuku tried to come up with a plan for how to beat these guys if it became necessary. The more immediately dangerous of the two was Handy. If he touched Izuku with 5 fingers, then Izuku would be out of the fight. But the one that needed to be dealt with first was Warp. Izuku wouldn't be able to do anything if he was there. His quirk made it so whatever Izuku did, it wouldn't help. As soon as Izuku became a danger, he could just teleport Izuku away to whatever battlefield would be best for Warp. Possibly Warp could kill Izuku just as easily as Handy. If his range was long enough, he could just drop Izuku into the ocean and let him drown. So Izuku needed to take down Warp as quickly as possible, then either incapacitate Handy as quickly as he could or just make a break for it. Warp was wearing a strange sort of armor around his neck. This probably meant that he had some physical component that required protection. If Izuku went after it, he could hopefully take him down. That was best left for the last resort though. Talking with them was preferable to getting in a fight. Suddenly the screen changed from Smash Brothers to static. "What?" Handy yelled. He must have touched his controller with all 5 fingers, since it crumbled to dust. "I was about to win." "Silence!" a deep and rasping voice commanded. Handy immediately shut up, slouching back into his chair with barely a sound. A complete and utter change from his demeanor seconds before. "I apologize for my associate," the voice from the screen continued. "I am an interested party looking to greet and offer a partnership to the recently debuted vigilante known as the Black Bandit. I take it that you are said person?" Izuku very carefully kept from making even the slightest movement. So this was why the villains had taken him here. Handy seemed way too unstable and impulsive to be a real threat. Something he'd revealed with the stunt with the mug. The best strategy would have been to keep his quirk a mystery so that Izuku wouldn't know his abilities. But Handy had gone for spectacle rather than the best strategic choice. Warp seemed professional and skilled, and armed with an incredibly valuable quirk. He didn't seem the type to follow someone like Handy. The person on the screen though. He quieted Handy, an uncontrollable and extremely dangerous villain, with only a word. That meant that more likely than not that these villains were both working for this person. Izuku needed more information. "Who are you?" Izuku asked. It seemed like a safe question, didn't give anything away. As I said, simply an anonymous party looking to invest time and energy into an up-and-coming person who seems to also realize the problems in our modern hero-focused society. Wait, so they were what? They thought that he was vigilanteing because he thought heroes were incompetent? And they were trying to convince Izuku to work with them? Also, the voice had completely failed to answer Izuku's question. Izuku changed his position from sitting lax on his chair to leaning forwards with his hands clasped together. "What is this proposal?" "Telegraph interest. Make them think he was hooked. Hopefully, they wouldn't attack him if they thought he might help them. You know that the hero industry has fallen into disrepair. If you join us, you can help fix this society, destroy the rot that is destroying it. Build a new and better world from the ashes of the old." Wow, that was the whole villain spiel. If Izuku believed a single thing this villain was saying, he might even have been interested. Time to play hard to get? Or play it playing hard to get? Either way. It's true, there are deep problems with society. But I'm no villain. Izuku crossed his arms, leaning back into his chair. There's a line between taking down the people the trash heroes don't bother with and actually destroying the society that gives heroes their undeserved power. I don't know if I'm prepared to step over that line. Please fall for it. Please. There is a line, the voice agreed. I'm glad that you understand Dash. But, the voice interrupted, you're lying. What? Sheet, did this guy have some kind of lie detection quirk? Or was Izuku just not as good at lying as he'd thought he was? "Kurogyri, Shigaraki," the voice commanded. "Kill him." The world froze. For a single crystal-clear instant, Izuku felt the world shift into complete clarity. It seemed like a single moment stretched impossibly long. Izuku felt his brain kick into overdrive and heard his heartbeat like a war drum in his ears. The static on the screen froze. Handy had stopped in the act of lunging towards Izuku with a disturbingly gleeful smile. There was black mist creeping towards Izuku from where Warp was standing behind the bar. Izuku knew what he had to do. He called on One for All and the world sprang into motion. Izuku kicked backward to avoid Handy as he lunged towards Izuku. The ground he landed on turned from hardwood to inky black darkness, and suddenly he was shooting towards Handy's outstretched fingers. Izuku kicked his leg out, sweeping it upwards and hitting Handy's wrist with an ear-piercing snap. Handy jerked backward, clutching at his broken wrist with a shout. In an instant, Izuku rebounded off the ground and shot towards Warp. The area in front of the villain filled with inky black darkness. Izuku punched to the left with all the power he could muster, changing his trajectory enough to hit the wall to Warp's right. He kicked off against the wall, speeding towards Warp's unguarded back. The mist sluggishly responded, moving to stop Izuku from impacting with Warp. Too late. Izuku landed with both feet on Warp's neck, flinging the strange piece of armor into the opposite wall. It impacted and fell to the ground with a metallic thunk, dented to the point of unrecognizability. The black mist faded away to nothing. The fight had lasted only seconds. Izuku really hoped he hadn't just killed Warp. The villain was probably resilient enough to survive being thrown around? Hopefully. As much as Izuku was fighting for his life right now, he didn't want to be responsible for someone's death. Handy was still shouting, so Izuku launched himself forward and locked Handy into a sleeper hold, carefully keeping Handy's fingers away from himself until he fell unconscious. Silence fell over the room and Izuku turned towards the static-filled screen. "I don't want anything to do with you," Izuku stated, just in case him beating up this guy's employees wasn't enough of a giveaway. "You're making a mistake," the voice warned. "I disagree." Izuku turned on his heel, walking with confidence he didn't feel towards the door. With one final nod at the screen, he shut the door behind him. Once he was outside, he started sprinting. He traveled across the buildings with as much speed as he could muster, changing direction every couple of blocks, just in case someone tried to follow him. After he was certain no one was following him, which took around 20 minutes of sprinting, he skidded to a stop and dropped into an alley. He let one for all drain away, then took a few wobbling steps before evacuating the contents of his stomach onto the ground. He took a few more steps and slid down the wall to sit with his forehead on his knees. That was terrible. He came so close to dying. He'd made so many bad choices. Who was that guy on the screen? He probably had enough power to completely bury Izuku if he managed to find him. Izuku needed to go home, but he let himself sit in the alley and breathe for a few minutes before dragging himself up to go and get his stuff from the hotel. Izuku pushed open the front door as quietly as he could. Inside the house was dark and quiet. The living room light was off. That meant that Mom wasn't waiting for him to come home again. He slipped off his shoes and crept silently through the house. How could he explain why he'd shown up the middle of the night? He didn't feel safe in Kamino after what happened. He'd even ran to another city to get on the train, just in case the villains were watching the Kamino train stations. But showing up in the middle of the night wouldn't be good either, since his story was that he was staying at Shinsu's house. He'd figure something out in the morning. He was too exhausted to think right now. Izuku opened the door to his room, then stopped and stared. "Midoriya-san?" Shinso blearily muttered from where he was laying on Izuku's bed. He looked up from his phone screen and blinked at Izuku. Izuku slipped inside, closed the door, and thought about flicking the light on before remembering he had blood on him. The light from the window was dim enough that Shinso shouldn't notice anything. "Midoriya?" Shinso asked, suddenly more awake, sitting up. He was wearing one of Izuku's shirts. The shoulders were far too wide for him. "You're back? Where were you?" Izuku stared at him. He had no idea what was going on. "That you're here?" Izuku eventually asked. Oh man, his cover was so blown. "Yes," Shinso said. Then he seemed to pause for a moment. He looked down at the shirt he was wearing, then at Izuku's bed. This was the first time Izuku had seen Shinso at a loss for words. There'd been times where he decided not to speak, but never when Shinso just couldn't think of anything to say. "We have a guest bedroom?" Izuku half asked, half stated. Well, they had a room that was half Mom's office and half storage room, but it had a couch that folded out into a bed. "Your mom said that I should just sleep in here, 'cause it wasn't set up," Shinso said in a tone Izuku had never heard from him. If the light was on, Izuku would probably be seeing Shinso blushing. Reasonable enough, he had just stolen Izuku's bed without asking. "Why are you sleeping at my house?" Izuku prompted. "It was late and Midoriya-san didn't want me going all the way home," Shinso said. "Why were you at my house?" This was getting a little tedious. "We were waiting for you to come home. Yagi-san already left, but I waited longer and your mom thought I shouldn't walk home by myself." "Yagi-san?" Izuku asked. "Yeah," Shinso said, then he shook his head and seemed to focus finally. "Yeah, no, I kind of expected your trainer to be, like, all might level muscled and really into protein. Yagi-san was totally not what I was expecting." Izuku stared at Shinso, then decided that it was too late to deal with this level of dramatic irony. Everything had gone to hell, but it was too late to do anything about that. "I'm gonna sleep," Izuku said. He walked to his dresser and grabbed a set of clean pajamas. "I could move," Shinso offered from behind Izuku. "It's fine. Good night," Izuku said, closing his bedroom door behind him. He was far too drained to deal with this right now. Izuku went to the bathroom, then took a shower to rinse the blood off and brushed his teeth in a daze. He put on his pajamas and stared into the mirror. His face looked strangely gaunt. Izuku hadn't eaten much in the last few days. He'd made enemies. He hadn't meant to, but now some extremely powerful villain and his cronies would be looking for him. Izuku sat against the door and buried his face in his arms. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do now. It wasn't like there was anyone he could convince that he was the Black Bandit. If he tried to convince All Might, it wouldn't go anywhere but an argument, and he didn't really know anyone else. He sat there and breathed for a while, trying to empty his mind enough to think. Eventually, he lifted his head from his arms and blinked at the bathroom walls. Would the villains be able to track him? It wasn't like he'd done anything to identify himself. and it wouldn't exactly be easy for them to have followed him, especially with how he'd taken down their warp-capable member. What should Izuku do? These guys were dangerous, he needed to be careful. What if he just did nothing? If the Black Bandit just disappeared, the villains would just assume that they'd scared him badly enough that he just chickened out. Which was pretty close to what Izuku was considering. Regardless, it seemed like a good idea, or at least the best available to him. Maybe that was why vigilantes were so rare compared to heroes and villains. They were targeted by both of those groups, and couldn't rely on help from anyone. That was a bleak thought. Izuku pressed his fingers into his eyelids. Okay, but what if Izuku waited until he got into UA and then started to work against these guys? He could find some hero at UA and somehow convince them that these villains were real and were a threat. Maybe he could even directly fight them once internship started. It seemed like a good plan, if you accepted good to be a relative term. Hopefully, it would still hold up when he wasn't so exhausted. Izuku stood up, stretching his arms and rolling his neck. He picked up his bag, then pulled out his Black Bandit stuff from it. The sweatshirt and combat gloves were slightly blood-splattered from the fights he'd been in, mostly just broken noses, though it was also from the few wounded people he carried to the hospital. He turned the sweatshirt inside out and rolled it into a ball. Izuku washed out the gloves in the sink. They were pretty nice, even had a layer of carbon fiber on the knuckles so he didn't hurt his hands when punching. He washed them until the pink water turned clear, then dried them with a towel. They were dark enough that there weren't any stains that Izuku could see. He wrapped them in a towel and put them into the bottom of his bag with his ski mask. Everything else he put in his bag on top of these, then carried it all to the kitchen. He pulled a garbage bag from under the sink and put the sweatshirt in, then tied it and stuffed it into the trash can. When he glanced at the clock it read 4, ouch. He could even see the sun starting to lighten the horizon through the kitchen. There were times during his more intensive training schedules when he had regularly woken up before this. He grabbed a pillow and blanket from off the couch and walked into the storage room. He stored his mask and gloves in one of the boxes in the closet. Izuku didn't even bother unfolding the couch into a bed. He laid down with the pillow and blanket and was out within a minute. When Izuku woke up, Shinso wasn't there. All Might was. Izuku sat down on the couch and vacantly stared at his mom. Just to her right was All Might, whose name was apparently Yagi Toshinori. The sight of the world's #1 hero sitting in Izuku's living room was giving Izuku whiplash. Izuku wondered if that was the hero's real name or just the one that he gave to civilians. You didn't answer your phone when I called you on Friday night. I was worried, but I thought that maybe you just forgot to charge it, Mom explained. So I found Shinso's contact information. It wasn't that hard. There's a lot of stuff online these days, so it was easy to find his school email anyway. Eventually I called him so I could check up on you. We were both surprised when we realized that you had lied about going to his house, she said, giving him a slightly sour look. We decided to meet up the next morning, Saturday, and try to figure out where you'd gone. We explored the neighborhood, checked some gyms, asked a few people. One of the people they asked was me. All Might, Yagi-sen offered. I was concerned, so I told them I was your trainer. I showed them our text conversations and we agreed to try and all search for you together. We looked until the neighborhood got dark. Yagi-san called his police friend, but they hadn't seen anything. We went back to the apartment and waited in case you came home. Eventually, I left because of an appointment I had this morning, but Shinso stayed with Midoriya-san. Shinso almost left after that, but I was worried about him going all the way to Saitama late at night, so I had him stay in your bed since the guest one wasn't set up. He left before you woke up so he wouldn't worry his foster parents. And I came back here this morning because I heard you had returned. All Might finished. Izuku listened to all this with a sort of horrified fascination. What a terrible string of coincidences that apparently just happened to spite him. It turned out that his phone breaking was actually a big deal. A burst of steam interrupted Izuku's thoughts. All Might had just transformed into his larger form. Apparently, All Might was telling Mom about trying to pass on one for all to Izuku. That was something. That continued on for a while. Izuku just sat there and let their conversation wash over him. All Might transformed back to his thin form. The buzz of their conversation turned to strained silence. All Might looked pensive and apologetic, but Izuku had no idea what his mom was thinking. Her expression was totally blocked off in a way that he'd never seen before. She was just sitting on the couch staring down at her hands. Yagi-san. All Might. Mom paused for a moment. Then she looked up at All Might with steel in her eyes. Please leave. I need to have a talk with my son. The room lapsed into silence as All Might left. Izuku sat in his chair across from Mom, feeling paralyzed. She still wasn't saying anything. She'd seemed okay when All Might was here, but now she'd gone silent and Izuku still couldn't tell what she was feeling. She was leaning forward with her hands clasped together in her lap. Izuku couldn't see her face. She reached out and gently grabbed his hand, turning his palm over and over in her hands. She let out a heavy sigh. Izuku, she said, voice calm and all the more deafening for it. You had me terrified. I'm sorry, it was an accident, Izuku said, trying to meet her eyes. All he could see was the top of her head. The silver roots peeking through her dark hair seemed to shine with their own light. No, it wasn't, Mom said in the same quiet tone. I promise it was, Izuku said, voice growing louder and feeling wrong-footed. I was going to keep in contact, it's just, my phone broke. I didn't have a way to contact you. I don't care that your phone broke, Izuku, Mom said in a defeated tone. You lied to me. You lied to your friend. Izuku pressed his lips together and tried to think. How could he get her to feel better? He was treading water and not making progress. I won't do anything like this again, I promise, Izuku said, trying to sound soothing. Yes, you will. Izuku froze, staring at her. He waited for her to say something else, but she just sat there. Izuku pulled his hand from hers and stood up, backing away from her. He hovered a few feet away, hand on the back of the couch, feeling more and more unsettled after each second of silence. Mom never doubted him, she always took Izuku at his word. Listen, I wasn't in any danger, I promise, Izuku lied. Mom still hadn't moved and he shifted uncomfortably. I never wanted to worry you, I just wanted to get some stuff done. I don't care that you worried me, Izuku, Mom said. Izuku froze. You lied to me. I won't do anything like it again, I promise. Izuku said, knowing it wasn't the truth. You've been lying to me for a while. Izuku stared down at her, not knowing what words he could say to fix this. You almost died twice fighting a villain. Izuku flinched, he'd forgotten about that. You agreed to take a dangerous power that would change both of our lives, took on a new trainer, didn't even tell me about it after everything was over. There was a pause and her voice grew even gentler. I know you, you're my baby boy and I know you better than anyone. I know you were never planning on telling me. You've always been sad, grieving every opportunity you've lost. But you pretend you aren't and I love you even when you lie to me. Izuku froze, not daring to even look up at her. When you were 4 years old, you grew up and it was my fault, Mom said. I failed you as a parent and I didn't even notice. Listen, it's all right, Izuku, I need to do something for me. Izuku nodded, desperate to fix whatever had gone wrong. Stop comforting me, please. It's not your job, and I never should have made it your job. Izuku gripped the cushion tightly in his hand. There was something in his throat, something painful and old. It's all right for you to just feel things, please Izuku, Mom said. I know you feel like it's all your burden and I know part of it is my fault. Izuku shook his head quickly, eyes filling with tears until they blinded him. I never gave you a reason to trust me, and I am so sorry for that, she said, and I know that it's unfair of me to ask this of you in some ways. But her voice cut off for a moment. Izuku could barely breathe. He finally looked up at Mom, she was looking back at him. Her eyes were filled with tears, they traced their way in huge droplets down her face like stars falling from her wide eyes. But I can't stand it anymore. Her voice of soft, please stop hiding everything from me. Please Izuku. Before he knew what he was doing, Izuku rushed to kneel before her and tried to pull her into his arms. She gently pushed him back, taking his hands gently in hers. Izuku, you can't fix this with a hug. She whispered, staring into his eyes even as she cried desperately. Izuku knew he was crying just as much. I know. Izuku managed through his tight throat. You can't keep lying to me, Mom said, brushing a hand that was still holding his own under Izuku's eye, brushing away the tears there. I'm sorry, I'll make sure. Izuku snapped his mouth closed. No more platitudes. The temptation was so strong. Just say that everything will be okay. Just smile and nod and pretend that nothing could bother him. He couldn't do that. He'd messed up. He knew it. He'd been messing up in a way that he didn't even know, probably had been for years now. And he didn't know what to do about it. I'll try. I can't tell you some things, he said in a whisper, voice teetering on the edge of breaking. I would if I could, but there are just things that I can't tell you, no matter how much I want to. He stared into her eyes desperately, trying to tell her how much he meant it. Mom stared back at him. After a moment that seemed to last an eternity, she finally smiled and pulled him into a tight hug. Izuku hugged her back as tightly as he could without hurting her. The room was silent and motionless other than the soft sound of sniffling, and for a moment Izuku was safe and everything in the world was alright because his mom was holding him and she loved him. Mom pulled back from their hug after a few minutes. She wiped at her eyes, sniffling, but smiling shakily. She reached forwards and held Izuku's face in her hands. She wiped the tears from Izuku's cheeks and smiled at him with a tint of sadness. She patted him on the cheek, then sighed deeply. She sat back on the couch and leaned against Izuku's side. Izuku was reminded just how small she was. He had grown a lot in the past few months, and now he dwarfed her as they sat in their tiny living room. Any more incredibly important revelations, Izuku? Mom asked with a smile in her voice. Well, Izuku couldn't tell her that he actually had one for all. Izuku just didn't know any way to tell her without driving a deeper wedge between them. Wait, did he forget to tell her about this weekend? Izuku said, unsure of how to start. Can I go grab something real quick? What? There was a note of dread in her voice. Izuku tensed against her for a moment. But her hand tightened around his own, and when Mom turned to him, she was smiling with a slight hint of self-deprecation. Okay, Izuku. There was a hint of laughter in her voice. What's another surprise today? Thank you for telling me. Izuku squeezed her hand, then left the room. He grabbed what he needed from the storage room. He sat down on the couch next to her with his black bandit ski mask and combat gloves. Have you heard of that vigilante that appeared in Kamino this weekend? Izuku, Mom said, a low note of exasperation in her voice. Well, that was accidentally, Izuku trailed off. Accidentally? Mom asked, voice dangerously lacking in emotion. I didn't mean to, it just kind of happened. If it matters, I already decided not to go out as him again. Izuku couldn't bring himself to turn his head and look at Mom directly. Izuku didn't so much as breathe. You're grounded. Things, strangely enough, went back to normal after that. Izuku told Mom everything that he could. Told her that he met some villains in Kamino and an abbreviated version of the night he'd stayed out till 2 in the morning. He didn't see All Might again. He was vaguely aware that Mom kept in touch with him, but Izuku told Mom that they parted on bad terms, so she talked to him but didn't invite him back. Izuku was grateful for the shield that his mom created, even as he felt guilty for not talking to All Might. It was strangely anticlimactic, even as it changed everything. He still went through the same motions, still went to school, still studied for his exams, still trained with Shinso for the UA practicals. He got a replacement for his phone, citing villain attack for its destruction. But it was different. Because when he was stressed and tired, he told his mom and she offered help and warm tea and kind words. Because Shinso stayed with them more nights than not until his mom cleared out the storage room and told him to just keep his stuff there. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, Izuku woke to hear the two of them talking over tea as Mom helped Shinso through his moments of anxiety and insomnia. Sometimes, there was something ugly in him that was angry that Midoriya Inko chose this moment to start being a caring and attentive mother. But then he remembered that his defining trait over the past decades had been a continual stream of lies, and that feeling died before it could come to the surface. And that's good, because sometimes Izuku and Shinso talked and laughed late into the night, joking about nothing and anything. Shinso quietly told Izuku about his long string of foster homes and everything he'd gone through. Izuku didn't know when, but he'd gained Shinso's confidence over the past months. Izuku had never had a friend before, hadn't let his mother in since he was 4 years old. But now he had that, and it meant more than he ever expected. The UA practicals were coming up, so Izuku trained with Shinso, studied hard, and practiced with his new quirk. He learned things like how if no one's watching, activating one for all made him glow with green lightning and that he could now swim faster than he used to run. He still lifted at the gym with Shin, so even though Izuku needed to borrow weights from other machines if he wanted to max out his weight, even if he wasn't using one for all. Izuku avoided looking at the punching bag that was conspicuously newer than all the others, but the punch of guilt and fear was less than it had once been. Izuku stared up at the huge building in front of him. UA really was an impressive place. Shinso, who was standing beside him, made a sort of coughing noise. He'd spent the night with them, since his house was much further from UA than Izuku's. Not that he needed the excuse, he spent the night at Izuku's house every time he had the chance anyway. They really do need to go all out, don't they? Shinso muttered. Gotta look all big and imposing. Izuku could see Shinso's hands shaking. That wasn't good. Shinso performed poorly when nervous. Izuku let his eyes rest of the flagstones and stopped. Shinso reluctantly stopped beside him. It's enough to make me nervous, Izuku said in an undertone. He kept his gaze locked downward, but knew that Shinso was staring at him. Good thing I've worked just as hard as anyone else to get here. And have as much a right to prove I deserve to be a hero as anyone else. Shinso let out a huff of breath. Not angry, but not with the air of nervous energy he'd had before. Right, he said. He turned back to the UA building and took a deep breath. Right. When they needed to separate to go to their assigned seats, Izuku gave Shinso's shoulder a reassuring squeeze and they wished each other luck. After the assembly and the written tests, Izuku stood in front of a huge gate and for the first time realized that he was going to be a hero. He did nothing to stop the wild grin that spread across his face. It was time to prove himself. Finally. The bell rang and Izuku sprinted forward before anyone else started to move. He took out robot after robot, though he paused to help some other kids who almost got crushed under the wreckage. He was punching a 3-pointer in the nose when a huge robot appeared. That was the 0-pointer. Izuku racked his brain trying to remember if the hero had told them it was going to be as big as a building. Well, Izuku could just ignore it, until he saw someone trapped under rubble, right in front of the robot. Her round face filled with terror even as she frantically tried to pull herself out of the pile of concrete while desperately calling for help. He'd probably be fine on points, at the very least better than most people. He already had a good amount and helping her was more important than scoring super high. He took a moment to think, before sprinting forward with one for all activated and reaching the girl when the robot was only a few feet away. He planted his feet firmly on the ground and stood above the girl with his hands held high above him. He called for one for all and strength flooded through his body. He had a moment to wonder if this was a spectacularly stupid idea. Too late to move now. The robot stepped right onto his raised hands. His elbows bent and his feet cracked the pavement under him, but he held firm. Within a moment the robot had tripped forward, wavering. But it continued onward with only a stutter in its step. Izuku let himself collapse to the ground and a minute later the girl finally freed herself from the rubble. She took a deep breath and flopped onto the ground. She pressed the palms of her hands into her eyes and held her breath for a few seconds. Izuku stood next to her, rubbing at his hands. She opened her eyes, staring at the retreating form of the robot, then at Izuku. "Holy shit," she breathed. Then she launched herself off of the ground and pulled Izuku into a tight hug. Izuku's arms hovered above her for a moment, before coming to rest on her back. That was terrifying. "Thank you. You were great. How'd you do that?" she asked, pulling away from him to smile at him. It only seemed a bit unhinged. "I need to sit down, give me a minute." She dropped to the ground again and leaned against a piece of rubble. Izuku saw her mouth form the shape of "holy shit" silently a few more times. You're welcome, Izuku said eventually. He could feel his own heartbeat drumming like thunder under his skin. He sat down next to her and patted her arm. The bell that signaled the end of the test rang out. Izuku stared at the girl, she stared back. She stifled a laugh in her palm and Izuku snorted. They didn't stop laughing until a healing hero came to check on them. The girl insisted on putting her number into his phone and told him to call him once he got his results. After it was all over, Izuku met Shinso outside the huge UA building. Shinso put his phone away when Izuku approached. He had a sort of self-satisfied smirk on his face that told Izuku that his friend's tests had gone well. I made another friend, Izuku announced, showing Shinso the girl's contact page. We're going to be heroes together. Shyness stared at him blankly, then shot his arm forward and grabbed Izuku's phone out of his hand. Oh, what's her name? Shinso said with a fake innocent look. You have it right there, Izuku replied with a smile that was just as innocent. Why can't you just read it? Shinso stared at him and after a few moments Izuku broke and glared back. Uraraka Achiko, Shinso said, handing back the phone. I knew that, Izuku said with fake flippancy. It took 3 months of you jumping over walls at me before I got into your contact list, but I left you alone for an hour and she's already managed it? Should have gotten yourself in mortal danger of being crushed by a giant robot, Izuku said with a shrug. Shinso snorted and started walking towards the exit. Of course you fought the zero-pointer, I should have expected that. Dinner at your house. I didn't fight it, it just stepped on me. Also, of course, Mom's making celebratory udon. Izuku's muscles burned with strain. He paused to bring his head above water and took a deep breath. The feeling of one for all crackled through his veins, filling his movements with power beyond what they should be capable of. Then he went back to paddling, each slide of his arms smooth and fast. The ropes dug painfully into his arms, but he ignored the feeling. As his head breached the surface again, he heard shouts from behind him and he stopped to listen. The people on the boat behind him shouted something, and Izuku looked in front of him to see the dock, only a few feet in front of him. The people on the boat were still talking, but Izuku ignored it. He took a finally deep breath and swam to the dock, pulling the boat behind him. He grabbed the edge of the dock, and with a flick of one for all, launched himself upward. He untied the ropes from his arms then carefully pulled the boat to the dock. The crew of the boat were still talking, thanking him and pronouncing their amazement that a quirkless boy could do what he just did. He focused on tying the boat to the dock. They tried to offer him money, but he dove back into the water before they could manage to give him anything. He pulled on one for all, and started to swim. He went fast, faster than he thought was possible. Faster than he could run before he started using one for all. Which was already pretty fast. Izuku tried not to think as he swam. It had been a week since the UA practical. He knew he must have passed. He knew it. He'd done well on the written portion. He'd destroyed dozens of robots. He must have done well. No one else in his group of practical exam candidates had come close to doing as well as he had. But there was a lingering feeling of doubt. A sliver of uncertainty. Something planted when All Might had refused to believe he had won for all. Something small and insecure. It was ridiculous but insidious. Izuku knew this. But he couldn't ignore the feeling. He focused on swimming. 2 strokes of the legs for each of the arms. Take a breath every third slide of the arm. Just focus on movement. Focus on the feeling of one for all crackling through his veins. That had been the point of going out in the first place. Just movement. Exercise had always been Izuku's way of centering himself. Focusing on training, don't worry about the future or the past. When he'd found the boat adrift, he'd offered to help because he wasn't sure what else to do. They'd refused at first, but once he'd started dragging them back they'd changed to admiration and surprise. Izuku focused on pulling the boat and ignored them. No more thinking. Just focus. Focus. But what if something happened during Shinso's test? What if someone rejected him because they were scared of his quirk for some reason? God damn it. Izuku got back to the house a few hours later. Muscles burning and sunburned along his back. Izuku! His mom's voice cried from inside. Izuku panicked and one for all crackled as he flung himself through the entryway and into the living room. He hit the wall hard and left a bit of a dent in the drywall. He stumbled and pushed against the wall for balance. Izuku! Mom cried again. She stepped out of the kitchen, waving a letter above her head. You've got your letter. From you, eh? Then she paused when she saw Izuku. Are you all right? I'm Dash. Izuku leaned against the wall, pushing down images of the villains he'd met having somehow hurt his mother. I'm fine. Just Dash. He made a vague gesture. Then his brain finally caught up with what his mom had just said. Wait, it's here. The feeling of dread jumped up his throat. It's here. Yeah, Mom said. She took a few steps toward Izuku, then touched his hand. He stared at the envelope. He knew it would be fine. It would be good news. Hey, Izuku, Mom said. Izuku looked up into her eyes. He tried to smile. You've got this, Izuku, Mom said, pressing the envelope into his hand. Thank you, Izuku said. Go on then, she said. Open it. I've been looking forward to this celebration dinner for months. You're going to love it. Yeah. Izuku felt a grin pulling at his mouth. Yeah, I am. He opened the thing in his room, then startled as an image appeared above the opened letter. It was All Might. Hello. I am All Might. There was a pause. All Might looked distinctly uncomfortable. Which you know. Midoriya. Izuku had a terrible moment where he thought that this was All Might trying to talk to him by faking a UA letter, then he continued. I am in town for one reason. I've come to teach at UA, All Might said. There was a pause, like someone out of frame was talking. Midoriya. You did well. You did unbelievably well. You far surpassed anyone's expectations during your exam. I'm proud of you. All Might's smile was wide, and even though Izuku saw an edge of regret, he still saw pride on his face. Izuku wanted to be anywhere but here. All Might wasn't even here. It was just a recording. But Izuku still wanted to leave. You achieved a respectable amount of villain points. An amazing feat, but there was a second set of points to this exam, All Might said. These are the rescue points. They are awarded for helping other students, even when you were not told that this would benefit you. All Might's smile turned bright. You would have passed merely with your villain points, but with the addition of the hero points, you scored the highest of all applicants of this year, All Might said. Congratulations, my boy. I know you've worked hard to be here. Izuku slumped into his chair. He passed. He'd done well. He started to laugh and almost wanted to cry. Midoriya, All Might said, then paused. Izuku could see something sad behind the wide smile. Welcome to UA. Shinso joined them for the celebration dinner. When he knocked on the door, Izuku opened the door so quickly it slammed into the wall. Shinso stood there for a few moments. He looked windswept and tired. The silence lasted long enough for Izuku to worry that Shinso might cry and he'd need to get Mom to come make him feel better. Then Shinso smiled. It wasn't like his normal smiles. It wasn't sarcastic or biting. It wasn't even self-aware. It was just happy. Just surprised and happy. Izuku had rushed forward out of the apartment and swept him up in a hug. He'd picked him up and spun the two of them until he was dizzy, laughing all the while. Shinso had made biting comments, but he'd been laughing too. Eventually Shinso had enough and escaped Izuku's arms. Then he tried to grab Izuku in retaliation. It had quickly devolved into a brawl, neither of them caring about the fact that they were outside of the apartment and the neighbors were yelling at them to stop. Eventually Mom came through the open door and they pretended nothing had happened. Shinso proudly told Izuku's mom that he'd passed his exams and she'd pulled him into a hug and cried tears of joy. The celebration dinner included a lot of crying, but all of it was happy. It was a fantastic dinner too. Mom had made them chicken teriyaki, beef bowls, and a number of sauces Izuku didn't know the name of. Between the two of them, Izuku and Shinso could eat truly ridiculous amounts of food, but there was plenty to go around. As they ate, Shinso finally told the story of his physical exam. He'd used the techniques Izuku had taught him, along with a metal pipe, to fight a number of the villain bots. He'd also gotten rescue points from saving another student when they'd been surrounded by the robots. Izuku had eventually told the whole story of his own exam to his mom and Shinso. Shinso had laughed, because at this point he'd accepted that Izuku was strong enough to seemingly survive anything. His mom had been horrified, but didn't push the issue. Shinso spent the night again, and they talked about what they would do at UA, and then what they would do when they were heroes. Before they could go to UA though, there was still middle school to finish. The news of Izuku's passing had gotten to the staff. On the last day of middle school, after his final class, the principal pulled him into the faculty office to congratulate him. They'd also brought Bakugu, which Izuku took to mean that he'd also gotten into UA. That was going to be a bit of a hassle. Honestly, since the whole thing with All Might, Bakugu had gone down considerably on the list of people that Izuku worried about, but he was the same as he'd always been. When they were surrounded by faculty, Bakugu was perfectly still and contained. But Izuku knew that the instant they were alone he'd explode. The principal was still talking, and Izuku shifted his weight from foot to foot. He needed to think of a way to deal with Bakugu. For one, Izuku knew that the longer he put off the confrontation, the more Bakugu would work to corner him. But honestly, sometime in the last few months, Izuku had lost the plot of what Bakugu was angry at Izuku for. It used to be just that he was bullying Izuku for not having a quirk, but now it seemed more complicated. Maybe something like jealousy mixed in? Izuku didn't really think that analyzing Bakugu would get him anywhere useful. Sure, he could try and figure the guy out, but what was even the point? He honestly felt like he was a bit beyond whatever playground drama that to all appearances defined Bakugu's entire personality. There was silence around him, and Izuku glanced up. The principal had stopped talking and Bakugu was glaring at him. Izuku bowed because that seemed the thing to do. The principal waved them out. Bakugu was watching Izuku carefully. And Izuku knew that if he tried to run, Bakugu would just chase him. It wasn't ideal, but the best way to deal with this would be letting Bakugu talk to him. Izuku pulled his backpack straps tighter and walked out the front of the building. They were barely out the front gate when Bakugu grabbed him by the collar and dragged him around the building. It was faintly ridiculous. Izuku was a whole lot bigger than Bakugu these days. With his training and the ways that his quirk was making him grow larger, he dwarfed most people. And while Bakugu was tall for a middle schooler, Izuku still stood half a head taller. Eventually Bakugu pulled him around a corner and rounded on him. He immediately started shouting. It was impressive even for Bakugu. There was finger pointing, small explosions, the whole deal. He was so invested in his rant that it took him more than a minute to realize Izuku had taken out his phone and was looking through the newest hero news. That was when he threw himself at Izuku, coming at him with swinging punches and wild kicks. But Izuku had been training in martial arts for over a decade now, and even without using his quirk, he was fast. Bakugu sent a wild punch at Izuku's nose, and Izuku ducked to the left. He grabbed Bakugu's wrist as it passed and sent him flying past him. Bakugu screamed and rounded on Izuku. This time he was more controlled, sending 2 punches, then a kick at Izuku's stomach. He dodged each of them, but knew that he was spending a whole lot more energy and Bakugu would win if this turned into a contest of endurance. More than that, Izuku knew that he was just making Bakugu more angry. That he wanted a fight. That just staying out of the way was a bad idea. But he was tired of managing Bakugu's moods. He was done with that. He was going to UA. They were on equal footing now. It wasn't Izuku's job to deal with whatever his problem was. By the time that Bakugu started throwing explosions at him, Izuku had decided this was enough. Izuku grabbed him by the arm and launched him away. Izuku could see him getting up, preparing to attack Izuku again. Bakugu, Izuku said. He slipped his phone into his pocket and crossed his arms. We should talk. Bakugu's head snapped up and he stared at Izuku. Honestly, Izuku didn't think he'd started a conversation with Bakugu for years now. Sure, he'd occasionally respond, but never started something. I tried that. Bakugu snapped. Okay, Izuku said. Why don't you want me to go to UA? Because it was supposed to be just me. Bakugu's hands were sparking, but he wasn't actively attacking Izuku. I was the only one who was supposed to get out of this hellhole. I was supposed to be the only one to get into UA. Oh. Izuku thought that maybe he knew that already. I also wanted to go to UA, so I applied. And I was good enough to get in. Good enough? Good enough. Bakugu shouts. You weren't just good enough. You, the quirkless, useless sheet, were good enough that you beat me in points. What the F dash? You lying, cheating bastard. Oh, I did. Izuku thought about that for a moment. All Might had said that he'd gotten the highest score of all the applicants, which meant that he must have beaten Bakugu. Izuku was reminded of that score he used to keep of his fights with Bakugu. Well, apparently this would be another tick for Izuku. Izuku then made a mistake. He laughed. Bakugu screamed. It was pure hatred and rage. Izuku tuned out the series of curses and threats he spewed out in favor of dodging the series of explosions and hits that Bakugu sent at him. It was terrifying, maybe more than even his run-in with the villains. Izuku had never once seen Bakugu this angry, and it brought back memories of being weaker and smaller than him. Of being beaten again and again. Of burns and cuts he'd lied about to his mom. Izuku jumped away from an explosion. There was a brief tableau. Bakugu was breathing hard, hands flickering with explosions and teeth clenched. Then Izuku remembered that he didn't need to stay here. He could just leave actually. So he did. He channeled one for all, gave Bakugu a mocking bow, then jumped up to the roof of a 3-story building. He turned and took one last look at Bakugu. He was staring up at Izuku. He still looked angry. Izuku took a running jump away from him and within moments was blocks away from Bakugu. Well, as far as last days of middle school go, that was pretty bad. A month later, it was finally time to go to UA. Shinso had stayed the night, since his house was far away from UA and it was easier to commute from Izuku's house. Not that he needed the excuse at this point, he rarely went home these days. Izuku didn't ask how Shinso's foster parents felt about this. It felt like one of those things better to not bring up. Izuku had spent the train ride reading Hero News. Shinso had spent it trying not to show how nervous he felt. They'd been admitted to the same hero class, 1A. Izuku was glad about that. It meant that if he ever zoned out in class, he could ask Shinso about what he'd missed later. Always something nice to have. The UA campus was a bit of a maze, but they'd eventually gotten to the right classroom. Izuku had ambled in, Shinso slouched behind him. The first thing he saw was Bakugu. He was here then. Same class and everything. That could only lead to trouble. When Izuku first entered, Bakugu was arguing with another student about something or other. But the instant he saw Izuku he went silent. He was sizing Izuku up, and could see the rage in his eyes. But Izuku knew that Bakugu would be cold and meticulous. There might be teachers around, so Bakugu wouldn't act until he knew what he could get away with. Izuku decided that it was a problem for another time and went to sit at his desk. Shinso slid to his own seat behind him, as silent and discreet as a shadow. He could be as sneaky as anyone Izuku had ever met, when he felt the inclination to do so. Which was cool but also probably a symptom of anxiety. Izuku was just taking his seat when the girl from the exams came in. Izuku felt bad but couldn't remember her name. But if he asked, Shinso would make fun of him. So he just greeted her and listened to her talk about the exam again. They'd called each other after Izuku had gotten his letter, and he'd learned that she only just passed the exam. She had a very extroverted and cheery personality, so Izuku was glad to talk to her. But his attention was diverted by Bakugu, who was still watching the two of them with a look that made Izuku wary. Izuku was still glancing over at Bakugu, which is why he noticed the instant someone walked through the door. It was All Might. Of course it was. Hello, students. All Might cheered. Congratulations on passing your exams. I am very proud of you all for your hard work and dedication. He was talking to the whole class but was looking at Izuku. Izuku stared back at him blankly. He'd known that All Might would be teaching at UA but had hoped he could avoid him. Looks like that wasn't an option. Izuku pulled out his phone and pulled up some news articles. He'd read them already, but there were always things that you could learn from hero fights. He was just getting into an article about a recent fight with Mount Lady when All Might finally left. He packed his phone away. When he looked up he was startled to notice that there was another teacher at the front of the class. Izuku hadn't noticed him come in. And he was staring at Izuku. Izuku thought that expression on his face was curiosity. Izuku stared back blankly, He was used to being stared at the instant he met someone at this point. The teacher tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "Change into your gym clothes and head out to the grounds," he said, tone bored but eyes focused. He bared his teeth. "We'll be doing evaluations today." The teacher didn't say anything to Izuku specifically, just sent them out to change into their gym clothes. As they walked to the locker room, Izuku could tell when the students around him noticed him and were caught in his quirk's effects. It wasn't subtle, not really. They'd just look over at him, fully register his presence, then be convinced that he was quirkless. There was an odd jerkiness to them, and of course there was the staring. Over the past few months, Izuku had gotten used to it enough that it was easy to tune it out. One of the boys, a friendly sort with bright red hair, reacted by trying to talk to him. Izuku took one look at his overly interested expression and set his gaze on the horizon. His classmate continued to talk to him, and Izuku allowed himself to make vague noises of agreement whenever there was a break in his classmate's chatter. This continued into the locker room, by which time every single one of the boys was sending him the occasional glance. Izuku steadily ignored it and changed into his gym clothes. "Right?" their teacher said. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere but there. "The one with the lowest score across all 8 events will be judged hopeless and immediately expelled." Izuku blinked. That seemed a little extreme. He ran his eyes over his new classmates. Many of them had obvious physical quirks which would help them in these trials. But it was more than likely that not everyone had a quirk suited for this kind of thing. It seemed unnecessarily cruel to expel someone from the school for failing a test as arbitrary as this. Izuku shook his head. It didn't matter anyway. It wasn't his problem. Then Izuku saw the look on Shinsu's face. Izuku'd forgotten. There was another person he had to be mindful of now. His teacher and classmates could do as they liked, but he couldn't leave Shinso high and dry. His mom would be sad if Shinso was expelled on the first day. Izuku sighed when he realized what he had to do. As a rule, he stayed out of the way of authority figures. It was a mutual thing. In elementary and middle school, they had been deeply uncomfortable with his presence and preferred to ignore it. He left it like that, since it gave him more freedom to do as he liked. Izuku would prefer to be ignored, but he was alright with being a lightning rod if it protected someone his mom liked. Izuku took a deliberate step forward. As one of the tallest students in the class, it was easy enough to get everyone's attention. The teacher, what was his name again? Looked at Izuku with bloodshot eyes. "Teacher-sama," Izuku called. There was a shifting among his classmates. Yep, that was his quirk anchoring onto the rest of them. "Midoriya," the teacher drawled. His head didn't move, but his eyes deliberately rolled in their sockets to fix themselves on Izuku. "That seems unfair." Izuku started. It had been a while since he'd pulled out all the stops with a hero analysis. Maybe he was rusty, but he still had it. There are a number of different types of heroes who are not really suited for the kind of strength being measured in this exercise. It seems unwise to dismiss them due to failing this kind of test. If all the heroes which don't fit into this specific mold are expelled or marginalized, then the heroes of the future would be left with a significant hole in their general makeup. What I mean is that there are heroes who are not optimized for fighting, say they specialized in something else, such as recovery, healing, or mental effects. These types would be disproportionately taken out from the pool of prospective heroes. Which, wow. "Stop," his teacher snapped. Izuku did so. The teacher stalked over to Izuku. His footsteps were utterly silent, but everyone was watching them. Izuku was reminded of how prey animals go silent and still when a predator approaches. Izuku tilted his head, allowing himself a vacant smile. "Okay then," the teacher said, his voice very quiet. Izuku was only slightly shorter than him, but he felt uncomfortably small with his teacher's glinting eyes fixed on him. "New deal, if anyone else gets last, they'll be expelled. But you, if you don't impress me, then you'll be expelled." There was a collective drawn breath among his classmates. Izuku thought about that for a moment. It wasn't very fair, obviously, but also, Izuku just tilted his head and said, "That sounds reasonable." The hero's blank face grew guarded. Izuku had a number of self-important teachers over the years. This guy pro-hero though he might be wasn't even the most ridiculous of them. The trick to it was to make sure they knew Izuku wouldn't play their games, then leave them to ignore you for the rest of the year. Seems that high school wasn't that different after all. Izuku stepped back with a nod, already disengaging from the conversation. After an awkward pause, the teacher continued talking. Students were moving and quiet conversations were starting. Izuku stood there in thought for a few moments. This was a test. Izuku looked up at the teacher, who was gamely ignoring Izuku in favor of setting up the testing equipment. Everyone else couldn't get last place, but Izuku just had to impress the teacher. Well, there was one rather clear loophole there. As the test started, Izuku just crouched and drew designs in the dirt with a twig. Was this a gamble? It seemed like the most straightforward way to deal with it. Was it what the teacher had meant? Their teacher didn't have any visible quirk, which could mean he didn't have one with a strong offensive capability. That could mean something, or Izuku could just be grasping at strings. Izuku flinched at a touch on his shoulder. He looked up and realized that Shinso was there. He looked pained, which Izuku figured was because everyone in the class was staring at him. For someone with bright purple hair, he wasn't terribly comfortable having people's attention on him. 50-meter dash, Shinso said, burying his hands in his pockets and looking away. Oh, thanks, Izuku said absently, squinting at the dirt. Okay, 50-meter dash, decision time. Did he want to do well and risk Shinso being expelled, or did he want to take the risk? He looked up at Shinso, who wasn't looking at Izuku at all. Well, if Izuku got expelled for trying this, he'd probably have been expelled sooner or later anyway. He ambled over to the starting line. Bakugo was beside him, giving him a look that meant he'd be attacking Izuku the instant there were no witnesses. Izuku should keep an eye on that, but for now he just ignored it and looked at the teacher. He was staring into the distance, expression bored. Izuku let himself lower into a relaxed crouch. He could feel one for all, pulling at the edge of his consciousness. It felt like a coiled spring, ready to go off at any second. But right now wasn't the time for it. The starting gun went off. Bakugo went flying forward with the help of his explosions, screaming all the way. Izuku walked forward. It took the class a few seconds to pay him any attention. But when they did, the silence was absolute. Izuku could feel all of their eyes on him but focused only on the finish line. 28.4 seconds, the teacher said, not giving any hint of a reaction. Izuku met his gaze and pasted on that polite smile he'd created for strangers who insisted on giving him unprompted pep talks. Izuku hummed and wandered off. The rest of the tests went similarly. Izuku walked through the endurance running, barely tried for the upper body training, and basically stayed upright for the toe touch. The teacher was no more forthcoming with his reactions as time went on. Izuku hadn't had a teacher with a better poker face than himself for years, which was making this more risky than it might otherwise have been. Izuku considered the fact that he might have made a terrible mistake here, but then decided that it was too late to stop now. That would be even more pathetic than just getting poor scores on half the events. The player that Izuku did not but probably should have considered came into play right after Izuku threw the softball 5 meters. Deku, you be a sturdy. Bakugo shouted, suddenly marching up to Izuku, who turned idly toward him. Oh, he'd made him really mad. Shouldn't he be happy that Izuku was performing badly? What the hell are you playing at? Izuku shrugged and gestured at the softball. Bakugo made a wordless sound of frustration and lunged toward Izuku, explosions sparking. Izuku, through years of training, reacted instantly and felt All Might's quirk light up across his entire body. He darted forward, grabbing Bakugo by both the arm and the back of his shirt, then dragged him off his feet and further forward. Izuku continued the turn for another 3 rotations, moving his feet like he would while throwing a discus to build momentum, before finally releasing Bakugo and sending him flying out into the field. He hung there for an unnatural amount of time, before he righted himself with his explosions enough that his crash back into the earth was just awkward rather than dangerous. 67.2 meters, the teacher said. Izuku turned to look at him, but the expression on the man's face remained exactly the same. No reaction to Bakugo's attack or what Izuku had done. Okay then. Izuku glanced at his classmates, blinking vaguely. They stared back with various expressions on the theme of incredulity. Izuku could practically see the cogs in their brain trying to work out the cognitive dissonance. And there was Bakugo, who even from this distance was visibly shaking with rage. After all the activities were done, the teacher stood in front of the students and stared directly at Izuku, who blinked lazily back at him. Izuku stared at the buildings in the distance. Some of them seemed almost run down, abandoned. That was strange. UA was an extremely prestigious school. Why would they have buildings that were Midoriya? His name brought him back to reality, and he saw that everyone was looking at him. That was honestly getting old. He couldn't be that interesting. He was just standing there. I was lying earlier, his teacher said, face splitting into a disturbing grin. I was never going to expel someone merely for lacking a quirk suited for physical combat. His tone wasn't angry, instead it was an odd kind of amused. Izuku abruptly felt rather ridiculous. Which was absurd, because he'd never felt like that before. In his defense, he'd never before had a teacher just admit that they'd done something unreasonable before. He had no idea what he was supposed to do in this situation. Which meant, of course, that he just kind of stood there and stared, before giving his teacher an assenting nod. He should probably figure out the guy's name. Anyway, the teacher tilted his head at Izuku, something piercing in his expression. What the hell were you thinking? Izuku said. What had he been thinking? Expelled. There was, just for a second, a break in his teacher's expression. Something calculating and amused at the same time. That was profoundly stupid. You're lucky I'm in a generous mood so you're not expelled, his teacher said, turning abruptly and walking away. Anyway, we're done here. The syllabuses and such are in the classroom. Be prepared for worse tomorrow. And with that he disappeared around the corner. The scoreboard appeared in front of them. Izuku had gotten last place. Which made sense, since that was what he'd aimed for. He took a cursory look through the scores, and realized that Shinso had gotten second to last. Well, even if it had been some kind of trick, it was probably good that Izuku had intervened anyway. Izuku glanced around. He found Shinso laying on the dirt and breathing heavily. He was staring at the scoreboard with an expression like he'd been punched in the gut. Izuku caught his gaze for a second, but Shinso just looked away. Izuku frowned. The rest of the class were still there, comparing individual scores and talking excitedly. Izuku had no reason to stick around. It wasn't like this test was meaningful. He was aware more than ever that a relevant quirk made all the difference in this kind of thing. In a physical test, All Might's quirk would always win. It wasn't a question of heroic skill, it was just the brutal calculus of a world where people were either born weak or strong. If Izuku had done his best here, it would just have proven that he had a quirk suited for this kind of test. It didn't mean he was a good hero, just strong. Anyway, Izuku wasn't there to compare himself to a bunch of high schoolers. Their comparative strength didn't matter. What mattered was if Izuku was stronger than the villains he would fight in the future, they were the ones he'd have to beat, not a bunch of first-year high school students. There was something though. Izuku looked back to see that Bakugo was glaring daggers at him. When Izuku caught his gaze, his teeth flashed. That was a real problem. Not currently though. Bakugo wouldn't try anything else, not when there might be a teacher around to see it. He was just not a stupid one. Still, as he walked back to the main building, Izuku angled his body so that if Bakugo did attempt an attack, Izuku would be able to see it. Izuku was the first back to the classroom and spent the time flipping through the course curriculum. It wasn't actually that different from a traditional high school, except only in the mornings. Afternoons were all for hero training. That was interesting. That was promising too. It meant that the boring things only happened in the morning. After that, Izuku packed up his backpack and headed out. The feeling of eyes on him told Izuku that he'd be having a conversation with Bakugo as soon as he was outside. The guy didn't learn. As he exited the building, he texted Shinso that he had stuff to do before he went home and so would meet him at the house. He frowned at his phone, considering the text. Was that presumptuous? Shinso had stayed at their house for weeks? Now that Izuku thought about it, he couldn't actually think of the last time Shinso had slept somewhere other than their guest room. That was weird, really weird actually, now that he thought about it. Didn't Shinso have foster parents or something? It seemed kind of irresponsible for them to The sound of explosions tipped Izuku off the instant before Bakugo would have gotten him. It was quick, but Izuku had been expecting it. Hence why he'd wandered into an abandoned courtyard in the first place. Years of experience made him drop and duck to the side. Bakugo always started with a right hook. He launched himself up at Bakugo before fully comprehending the situation. He managed to snag the back of Bakugo's jacket as he went and flung him away in a violent twisting motion. Bakugo righted himself with a series of explosions and landed in a half-feral crouch. "What the F was today?" he hissed. Izuku glanced at his hand, then realized that his phone was no longer there. He looked around for a second, before seeing that it had been thrown to the other side of the courtyard and was definitely shattered. Again? Izuku sighed, half-heartedly slipping out of his backpack for maneuverability. He tossed it under a bench in the hope that it would be protected enough for the next few minutes. He deliberately slipped out of his jacket and tie, throwing them on the bench, before turning back to Bakugo. "First day of school," Izuku answered. "You little..." Bakugo cut off his own insult by launching himself toward Izuku, who tried to dodge to the right. Unfortunately, Bakugo knew Izuku's fighting style as well as Izuku knew Bakugo's, so he had an explosion ready in the exact place Izuku dodged to. He got his hands up in front of his face in time but was still sent hurtling backward. He managed to transform his momentum into a tumbling roll before springing into a crouch. Bakugo was across from him, waiting for him to recover in a surprising display of civility. "What do you want now?" Izuku asked. "We're both officially going to UA. It's not like a couple explosions are going to make me quit." "Uff," Bakugo said, hands sparking in time with his words. "That's not..." He, to Izuku's complete shock, forced his hands down to his sides. "What were you doing today? Why pretend to be weak?" "I wasn't pretending," Izuku said, head tilted. "I was just being strategic. It worked, didn't it?" "You know what I mean." Bakugo snapped. "You could have gotten one of the best scores in the class. Those idiots are barely competent. I don't know what happened with you, but don't think that just because you've gotten stronger you can toy with the rest of us." "Wow, that's rich," Izuku said, feeling one for all crackle in response. He forced it down. This was his fight. He'd beaten Bakugo plenty of times without it. Now, try applying even a shred of self-reflection onto what you just said. "I don't toy with people." Bakugo stomped toward Izuku, hands sparking but not raised. "I'm good, so I let people know. But at least I'm honest about what I can do and don't pretend to be weak out of some kind of..." Bakugo had never quite managed Izuku's level of prediction in fights, so he was taken entirely flat-footed when Izuku's fist made contact with his jaw. Izuku continued the motion to the ground and brought Bakugo with him, keeping a hold of his shirt collar even as Bakugo sent a painful kick directly into his stomach. When in very close quarters, Bakugo couldn't use his explosions, since he wasn't entirely immune to his own fire. It was a weakness that Izuku had taken advantage of countless times. The fight that followed wasn't pretty, or even particularly skillful. When pressed, they both fought like wild animals. But more than that, something about this was bothering Izuku. It was in a moment when they'd separated, both carefully watching each other for the expected attack, when Izuku realized what it was. They were fighting as equals. It wasn't like Bakugo had tracked Izuku down and surprised him. Izuku could have avoided this. He'd intentionally gone somewhere isolated and in doing so had tacitly agreed to fighting Bakugo. The thought was enough that he didn't react nearly fast enough when Bakugo flung himself at Izuku again. He was sent sprawling backward in a series of uncontrolled tumbles. Then suddenly Bakugo was on top of him, trapping Izuku's arm with a shoulder and holding his sparking hand directly in front of Izuku's face. His teeth were bared and his expression filled with nothing but extreme hatred. Why the hell had Izuku come here? What? Nothing to say, you useless effing Deku? Bakugo taunted, bringing his sparking fingers close enough that Izuku could feel their heat on his face. That was Izuku's cue to say, "That's an oxymoron and so are you," or something equally defiant but pointless. Instead Izuku just stared back. Bakugo grew more and more disconcerted as Izuku said nothing and made no effort to throw him off. Eventually he just shoved Izuku's head back into the hard-packed earth and took a few quick steps back, still wary of Izuku's retaliation. Was that what this was? Just a series of endless retaliations? Why are we still doing this? Izuku asked, pulling himself up to a crouch and absently pressing a hand to one of the fresh scorch marks littering the ground. What? Bakugo said, taking another step back. He was holding his right wrist and grimacing. Maybe Izuku had overdone it with that Nikio lock. Fighting, Izuku clarified. It always ends in one of us winning, then we just do it again within a week or two. What's the point? Bakugo had barely reacted to Izuku's punches, but reeled back from that. His mouth was moving but didn't form words. Izuku gave him a few minutes, but there was nothing forthcoming. Right? Izuku sighed, standing up. He slung his backpack over his shoulder and picked up the shattered remnants of his phone. He glanced at Bakugo, who hadn't moved. I'm going to try convincing the school nurse to heal this. He gestured to the brand new burn that stretched along his calf. I'll see you tomorrow. He trudged away. This time, Bakugo let him leave. I'm home. Izuku called as he walked through the door. Izuku! Mom called back. As soon as she saw Izuku, she let out a little alarmed sound. What happened? This was rather inevitable. In elementary and middle school, Izuku had generally tried to clean up his uniform or change before Mom saw all the burns and tears. Or at least come up with an anecdote explaining what funny incident had happened this time. But he hadn't expected Bakugo to attack him on the first day, though he probably should have, so hadn't had a chance to stash a spare uniform somewhere. For a second, Izuku had the impulse to tell the truth. Kaken from kindergarten attacked me, but also maybe I instigated it and kind of have been doing so for years now? But that didn't come out. Instead he shrugged awkwardly. Plus ultra? He offered, scratching at the back of his neck. Things got a little out of hand. Oh no, she tooted. She pulled his pant leg this way and that. There was basically nothing left of it below the knee. It's healed. Yeah, Izuku said, trying to be cheerful. They've got a support hero who can heal things instantly, it's pretty great. But still, your pants, Mom said with a sigh. Then she seemed to realize what he'd said and her gaze sharpened. Young man, promise me that you won't let yourself get hurt just because there's someone there to heal you. Yes, ma'am, Izuku said. Good, Mom answered. Izuku said awkwardly, holding up something that had once been a cell phone. But I did break this again. Oh Izuku, Mom said, shaking her head. We've got to get you a... Izuku didn't hear the rest of it, because Shinso was standing in the doorway. Eyes flicking nervously at the various tears and burns across Izuku's uniform. For a second, Izuku was sure Shinso was going to get Izuku caught in yet another lie. But instead, he just got a little paler and ducked back into the living room. Izuku frowned. Was everyone acting odd today? He looked down at Mom, who was fussing with his uniform and making noises about contacting his teacher. Not everyone. Why'd you do that? Shinso asked later that night. What? Izuku asked, looking up from his laptop. He'd been trying to calculate how many hours of homework he'd have per day based on the syllabuses they'd been given. The results were not promising. He blinked when he realized that it was much darker than when he'd last paid attention. Since he'd last looked up, Mom had disappeared from where she'd been doing paperwork at the dining table. Shinso was perched awkwardly on the armchair, not quite looking at Izuku. Why'd you, Shinso? Stopped himself and scowled into the carpet. Don't get yourself into trouble for me, I can take care of myself. Izuku blinked at him. Was? Oh yeah, Izuku had decided to do his stunt with the PE activities because he'd thought Shinso would get last place. Don't give me that look, Shinso said. You know what I'm talking about. I don't need a babysitter. Oh, well, Izuku stared into the distance and tried to think of a good way to say, it's not so much that I want to babysit you as I don't want Mom to be sad because you were expelled. Just don't do it again, okay? Shinso said. I mean, I thought you'd be expelled, Izuku said. I figured it was worth it. You didn't know that. Shinso snapped. Aizawa-sensei could have just expelled you. Oh, that was his name. Or just decided to expel me anyway. And you didn't even know that I would have gotten last place, you just assumed. Well, I was right, so, Izuku said, looking back down at his laptop. You're so... It was so much easier to deal with you when we just went to the gym together, Shinso muttered. Then why are you here? Izuku asked. Just leave. Nothing's stopping you. The silence that followed was a little too loaded. Izuku finally looked up and saw that Shinso's face was blank. Not a normal apathetic kind of blank, but the kind that someone put up when they couldn't allow anyone to know that they were feeling anything. That could be bad. Shinso wasn't the type to stop himself from voicing his grievances. If he wasn't willing to tell Izuku something, it was probably serious. What? Izuku asked. Oh, Shinso muttered, then stalked out of the room. What? Izuku woke up at 4:49 in the morning. He spent a good 20 minutes laying there, repeatedly opening his eyes to see that yes, only a minute had passed. He still felt exhausted. He knew that more than likely, getting up now was going to keep him exhausted for the rest of the day. He closed his eyes and shoved a pillow over his eyes. What was Shinso so upset about? Izuku refused to lie here and try to parse the motivations of other people. If they wanted to tell him, they could. Izuku threw the blankets off him and got up with a yawn. He stumbled into the bathroom. His hair was doing that annoying thing again, where it was completely flat on the side that he'd slept on. He wasted a minute trying and utterly failing to fix anything. He gave up and went to the kitchen, where he grabbed a banana and a few spoonfuls of peanut butter. Then he went back to his room and pulled on his workout clothes. Finally, he spent a few minutes searching before he remembered he'd broken his phone yesterday. Should he grab his uniform? No, he should have time to come back here before classes started. He stepped out the front door of the apartment and stopped. The sunrise was fantastic. A pale pink sky, edged with orange and deep red, dotted with pale, wispy clouds lit up with gold on the bottom edges. Sighed and spent a minute there, leaning on the railing outside of their front door. Izuku! He started, turning to see his mom standing in the doorway to the apartment. She was wearing her pale blue scrubs and holding a huge thermos he knew contained a day's worth of hot coffee, though she'd finish it within 2 hours. Mom, he said sedately. Mornings. Good morning, she said, gaze caught on the sky behind him. She stepped up beside him, setting a hand on Izuku's arm as she leaned in next to him. Oh, that's lovely. Yeah, he agreed. They stood there for another few minutes. Okay, I'll be late if I wait any longer, Mom said, giving Izuku a brief hug. Alright. Here, I'll walk you down. The elevator ride to the bottom floor was quiet. But once they stepped out, Mom turned toward him with a frown. What happened yesterday? She asked. Izuku tilted his head. First day of school? He tried for the second time. Don't, she sighed and turned her head. I thought you were going to start telling me things. Did Shinso say something? Izuku asked, then cringed at himself. No. Izuku, I am your mother, she said, rubbing a hand at the bags under her eyes. I can tell. Sorry, Izuku said. Don't apologize if you're just going to. She stopped and took a breath. I've got a double shift, so I won't see you until tomorrow. I love you. Have a good day at school for me, all right? Okay, you too, he said, then stood there as she walked to the bus station. He mentally cursed at himself for a while. But once Mom was out of sight, he turned and started running toward the beach.